You are here because I need somebody to trust. I ain't forgot the time you helped me out in the past. Though maybe you didn't know it was me you was helping exactly. Nobody inside the outfit can be trusted with this. I need somebody from the outside.
I'm not following you, Al.
When I heard what Frank's planning, I said word to him. You can't do this, Frank, I said. You gotta find a better way, Frank. And you know what he says? Through that lawyer he is. You're inside, Al, and I'm out of here handling things now. That's what he says. You know what Frank's planning?
No?
Guess.
I can't.
No, really. Take a shot. Guess.
Gang war? He hit Newberry already.
Yeah, you can kill somebody time to time. If you don't do it on no big scale or make a habit out of it. But there's some people you just can't hit.
Such as?
Such as the mayor of a big city.
What?
Cermak. Frank's gonna hit Cermak.
You're shitting me.
I shit you not. What did I pay a grand to come down on the Dixie Flyer to tell you my life story?
I saw Nitty in the hospital. He hates Cermak, all right. I guess it's possible he tries something like that, but it seems...
Crazy? Not just crazy, Ella. Suicide.
Observations with Robert Meyer Burnett.
I've heard it said before, like, it was a very smart man named Robert Meyer Burnett who said the currency of our current age is authenticity. And it's so true.
Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your master of fun and wonder, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your sommelier of sci-fi and cinema, your collector, your evangelist of the imagination, and, of course, the maybe never to be defined existential Mr. Rogers. That's right, me, Robert Meyer Burnett, and I'm Rob-casting you. You imagination connoisseurs, you members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity community. This is Robservations, episode number 1015. How are you all this evening? I hope well. What a bunch of wacky stuff happening in and around the country. Craziness. And we got a Fantastic Four trailer today. So, you know, it probably would come as no surprise to any longtime watchers of this channel that I think a lot about the motion picture industry. And movies, of course, themselves. But for me, I've always said, cinema is the art form of the 20th century. Feature films started to get made in the 20th century. It was an art form that didn't exist because the technology to make movies didn't exist. It's had its origins in the first zoetrope in the early 18th century, and then in the latter half of the 18th century, or pardon me, the 19th century. And I always... I think 1800s, 18th century, but it's the 1800s or the 19th century. And then we got the first feature film in the very beginning of the 20th century, a couple of years in, 6 years in, I think. The Kelly Gang, is that what it was? And so I was born into a world where the cinema art form was, I would say, if it's the century you're born in, if something is created in the century that you're born in, you're of that century. Like social media is a 21st century invention. The smartphone, the iPhone came out in 2007. So, I mean, that's that you own it, If you're a child of the 21st century, that's what you get to claim. And your life is shaped by that. Now, one of the things that I've always found sort of interesting is that when I started to watch movies when I was a little kid, it was possible. I mean, we didn't have the technology. We didn't have VCRs. You had to wait until things just showed up on television. We had in the olden days, we had 3 cables, television stacks, 3 stations, and no cable. We had ABC, NBC, CBS, a local affiliate. They were local affiliates, and then we had a PBS station, and then 1 independent station. Later became 2 independent stations. So really, there was 6 stations on TV when I was growing up. And not all of them showed movies. So when I became a movie fan and my mother would bring the TV guide home, usually on Wednesdays or Thursdays when she went grocery shopping for the week, then I could scour the TV guide and see what movies were coming on. And I was at the time looking for science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And that's all I watched when I was a kid, pretty much. And it's sort of, as I got older, I branched out into other things, like mysteries were interesting to me. Crime became interesting to me. So I wasn't just watching fantasy films. I started watching more movies about the real world. And there was a lot of them. But it seemed like you could see everything in a way. I mean, obviously, that was not true because there was just too many things to watch. But you could have had a handle on it, especially with science fiction, fantasy, and horror films. There weren't a lot. I mean, there were a lot, but there weren't a lot really that were worth watching. So as I started to read film books, a lot of the same movies were talked about. And it seemed, and then the explosion of quality science fiction, fantasy, and horror films really began in the 70s. And you had The Exorcist and The Omen that brought a certain highbrow nature to horror that it didn't previously have. I mean, there were things that were, there was always great horror movies made, but a lot of it had more of a pulp heartbeat to it. When they made Rosemary's Baby in '68, obviously that was a lot more grounded and real. And we didn't have a lot of, there wasn't a lot of great stuff. There wasn't a lot of movies people would say, oh, that could have been nominated for the Academy Award. I mean, Exorcist was. I think Rosemary's Baby did. I think Ruth Gordon, got an acting nomination. There was a lot to take in, but not much of it was great. But then in the wake of the films, as we saw the big blockbuster films, The Godfather, Exorcist, Jaws, Star Wars, Close Encounters, the Spielberg-Lucas era, and as things moved forward, once the floodgates opened for science fiction, fantasy, and horror films, there was a lot more highbrow stuff that was starting to get made with a lot more, the talent was bumped up as well. I mean, when Richard Donner directed a movie like The Omen and then went ahead and made Superman, it was really interesting to watch these things occur. And I got to see them because I was watching movies at the time. And going from the 70s to now, I've watched 50 years of genre cinema. I've been able to sort of move through it as it happened, which is why I take such delight watching all of these reaction channels that are talking about movies that I saw when they first came out. And it's interesting to watch people go back and look at them from today's perspective. And they're going back. And the reason I find that interesting is because movies have changed. And what the output from the studios has been has changed significantly over the last 50 years. And the art of cinema, as I've talked about a lot on this channel, has kind of fallen away. Art used to be this sort of frisson between art and commerce, but now there's a lot more commerce and a lot less art because movies have become, especially at the studio level, really expensive to make. I mean, we used to see studio movies that were getting made less than $10 million, $20, $30 million. A $30 million studio movie was a big movie. It wasn't until the 90s and Terminator 2 that we had the first $100 million movie. And I remember when that movie went into production, that was a huge number. And a lot of the reason for that was the visual effects, obviously, and its compressed production schedule. But what was interesting is as I was growing up loving movies as an art form, I wasn't just watching one kind of film. I was watching all movies. And it didn't matter whether I was watching a comedy, like I loved Tootsie, I loved Auteur, loved movies like Foul Play, and I also like lowbrow comedies. I loved Animal House. Animal House actually had a lot of very sophisticated humor in it, believe it or not. But then I would see things like, I was 12 years old when I saw all that jazz, and a few years later I saw The Verdict, and I remember seeing The China Syndrome and walking out of The China Syndrome thinking, man, that was a banger. I didn't use that word yet. It hadn't been invented in that kind of a way. Banger meant something else. But it it started with movies, but movies led me to a love of storytelling in all of its forms. I started reading. I started listening to classical music because of soundtrack albums. I went to more plays. I saw operas. My grandmother took me. I went and saw. I remember she took me to see the ballet Coppelia, and we went and saw it in December of 1979. And I remember that because I had to go see a ballet rather than go see the Black Hole, which was annoying. But Coppelia was kind of about a robot, so that was kind of neat. So I was interested in that, but it fostered an interest in all of these things. And it turned out that I watched more non-genre. I mean, you could say that crime thrillers were genre. I watched lots of genre cinema, but not so much science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Because even though a lot of it was coming out, I watched a lot more than just genre cinema like that. Again, I said I'll watch anything. I'd watch a thriller. I'd watch a romantic drama. I remember seeing a movie with Albert Finney called Shoot the Moon that I really, really liked. I really liked Alan Parker's Fame. That was a big movie I loved. Well, I was talking to my friend Rob G the other day, and Rob G is in film exhibition. And we have long conversations about the state of the business. And it was interesting. He said to me that he was watching John Frankenheimer's Black Sunday. And Black Sunday was based on a book by Thomas Harris. That was his first novel, and then he went on to write Red Dragon, Silence of the Lambs, and Hannibal. Yes, he created Hannibal Lecter, but his book Black Sunday was about a terrorist attack on the Super Bowl. And Frankenheimer made some of my favorite films of the 60s. He made Birdman of Alcatraz. He made a great political thriller I recommend everybody watch called 7 Days in May. He made one of my favorite political thrillers of all time, The Manchurian Candidate, with Lawrence Harvey and Angela Lansbury as one of the most evil women in film history. I think my three favorite villainesses in cinema history are Angela Lansbury in The Manchurian Candidate, Anne Baxter in All About Eve, and Sharon Stone as Catherine Trammell in Basic Instinct. There are many more, but I mean, those are just off the top of my head. I dearly love those characters. And Frankenheimer also made one of my favorite science fiction movies of all time that stars Rock Hudson and Salome Jens, the leader of the founders in Deep Space Nine, called Seconds. And if you've never seen Seconds, please do yourself a favor and go see it, because it is startling. And then, of course, Frankenheimer moved into the 70s, and he made Prophecy. He made French Connection 2. He didn't reach the heights he'd reached in the 60s, but I do think that Black Sunday is a banger. And it's a terrific, really tense film. But one of the things that Rob G was telling me was how naturalistic it was, how it felt like it was a movie populated entirely by adults who are acting like adults doing adult things. And we both kind of laughed, and I said to him that I had recently, and Robert Shaw is in Quint from Jaws. Robert Shaw is in Black Sunday, and I told him that I recently watched on the Kino Lorber 4K that was released, the original Taking of Pelham 123 with Walter Matthau and Robert Shaw. And we were both commiserating and talking about how both of those movies felt like we were watching reality captured. Like, all the people looked real. It's hard to explain, because in the 70s, there was what was known as sort of documentary filmmaking. And what happened was you had filmmakers applying documentary cinema verite film techniques to narrative features, which wasn't really done before. This was something that came about in the late 60s and 70s, where you had people like William Friedkin brought his documentary sensibility to movies like French Connection and The Exorcist. And I'm always caught up in verisimilitude. And this was peak verisimilitude. And I've told this story before, but I remember hearing a story where Friedkin was talking to his director of photography on French Connection, and they were shooting a scene where Popeye Doyle was going to come out of this bar and walk down the street. And Friedkin did not tell his cinematographer. I don't know if it was Owen Roisman. Did Owen Roisman shoot French Connection? Maybe he did. The cameraman wanted to know which way was Gene Hackman going to go. Was he going to go left or was he going to go right? And Friedkin didn't tell him. Didn't want to tell him, because he wanted that the unsure nature of the camera, the pan, to, be a little herky-jerky. Because what was happening was when you're shooting documentary stuff and you're out in the field, you don't always have a locked off camera and you don't get perfect shots. You get what you can. And Americans had become so aware of this because they saw so much combat photography footage from Vietnam on the nightly news. So they were able to understand that kind of imagery. And Hollywood was able to incorporate that idea into movies. And it created, when you're shooting movies with a lot of natural light and you're shooting them in real locations, you were creating a verisimilitude. And the people that were hired, like if you look at the people in movies, especially in the 70s, there's not a lot of beautiful people. Like, I've maintained that one of the interesting things about youth film today is that all the kids are too good looking. Kids are goofy looking. We represented a wide spectrum of humanity. And if you watch like John Hughes movies, and I've said this a million times on the show, but Molly Ringwald was no great beauty, but she had a unique beauty that was uniquely Molly Ringwald. No one else looked like her. Matthew Broderick, when he played Ferris Bueller, he had a great look to him, but I wouldn't say that he was startlingly handsome, but he looked great as Ferris Bueller, as that character. Alan Ruck, not a traditionally handsome man, but Cameron had a face like you'd never seen before. John Cryer as Ducky in Pretty in Pink had a great, unique look, and there was a reality to them, a naturalness to them that really doesn't exist anymore. Because the people that you see, the people that have gone into acting are all quite beautiful. I mean, one of the things I think Meryl Streep is an incredibly beautiful woman. And if you see movies that she was in the 70s, she was a strikingly beautiful woman, but she had a uniqueness to her face. You didn't see, Meryl Streep's were not a dime a dozen. And there was something classical, almost Greco-Roman in her face. And it was so unique and so striking when you saw her. I remember seeing her in, I think it's Manhattan, where Woody Allen used to be in a relationship with her, and she's written a book about their relationship, and he finds her on the street, and she's like walking down the street, and you see her cascading hair, and she's striking, but she looks like she exists in the real world. And I've said before, like Jaws 2 had a group of teenagers. They're all kind of goofy looking. And that goofiness added to the verisimilitude. And then something changed. Something changed as we left the 80s and moved into the 90s. And people just became, I don't know, they looked more like actors and less like real people, even though that doesn't make any sense because they are real people. But when every part is populated by attractive people, then things lose that sort of verisimilitude because you're now seeing something that is more artificial. And there's still actors that I really, really love in movies. Like I thought the juxtaposition of Paul Giamatti and Thomas Hayden Church in Sideways was great. Thomas Hayden Church is an unconventionally handsome man, and Paul Giamatti is very Paul Giamatti. And they worked really well together. You believe those two guys. And the way Alexander Payne shot that movie, you believed it was happening. And that's what I'm looking for, because I love it when I believe movies more. And it's a hard thing to put your finger on. But now, as I've gotten older and I've been watching, I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I'm not a fucking boomer yet. And I hate that is the most, the okay boomer thing is that's another, in our meme culture and our single line takedown culture, it's just so deeply stupid. I love a great insult. If you're going to insult me, make it good. And then I can at least go, that was good. I like that insult. But anyway, so I started thinking about what Rob was saying, and I was thinking about watching Taking of Pelham, and Rob was watching Black Sunday, and I was thinking about when you watch those films now, and this struck me, and Rob said the same thing. He talked about, oh, this is a movie about the adults in the room, or something to that effect. His friend who he was watching said something to that effect. And I felt the same way. I was watching Taking a Pelham 123 by myself, but what struck me is I'm like, wow, I'm watching a movie about real adults doing real things who have real jobs, and it struck me that we very seldom see this in a movie today. We very seldom see reality, even in movies that are about the quote unquote real world. Everything looks too clean. Everything is too designed. And I think because of that, we don't believe it as much. I mean, no one's really done psychological studies on the effects of cinema storytelling on the human brain. I mean, maybe somebody has, but I'm unaware of them. Like, what gets inside more? And I honestly believe, I have no studies to back this up, but one of the things, the joys of seeing movies in a theater is psychologically you're much more focused. I mean, one of the things that bums me out about people who bring phones and look at their phones in movies and things like that, it's distracting, but what it tells me is that I inhabit a world with people like them that are less smart than the people I want to associate with. If they don't have the attention span, and somebody always says, well, Rob, what about somebody who's expecting a message from the babysitter and all that? I'm like, most of my life, we didn't have that. We didn't have cell phones, smartphones that people were whipping out in the middle of movie theaters. This is a new phenomenon. So I know that life existed and people got by before smartphones. And I hate that because it shows, it says a lot about people that pull out their phones in movies, about them. It tells them they don't think about other people. So you know that they're selfish on many different levels. And yeah, I'm Judgy McJudgerson. And I when it comes to that, it bothers me. Because the act of going into a movie theater is you're opening your mind. Again, this is personal belief. You open your mind to what you're being given on the screen, what you're seeing on the screen. And if you're distracted, it interferes with your ability to take in what's happening. And I hate that. But I would like to read a few articles. I got a few articles that I'd like to read that I found that I think that will illuminate some things I've been trying to address. And the first, I went back to find a couple of things, but this article is from Variety. And this article was published on November 23rd, 2003. So this article is obviously 22 years old. Well, almost. It'll 21 years old because it's November, but almost. The Cinema of Naturalism. Filmmakers eschew formula, conventional narratives to capture real life. When Catherine Hardwicke found her primary location to shoot 13, she didn't just choose a real lower-middle-class residence as a home for Evan Rachel Wood's troubled teen Tracy, with cramped hallways, worn-out carpets, and stifling rooms. A vet production designer, Hardwicke, with designer Carol Strober, decided to fill the chest drawers in Tracy's bedroom with clothes, socks, underwear, and everything else a 13-year-old turning woman might desire. What sounds like indulgence, repeat viewings of 13 barely reveals the drawer's contents, is actually strategy. There's the practical aspect, said Hardwicke, because I learned as a designer on set that you never know when you'll need something like a sock. But the mission behind my movie was to create a complete, enveloping sense of the real, even hyper-realism. It was the only way I could convey teenage life teetering out of control. This is not your father's Hollywood of false storefronts that still teem the backlots like so many ghost towns, but a concerted effort toward naturalism. Just this year, it includes a broad spectrum of films, from the handheld approach of 13 and Robert Altman's fly-on-the-wall look at the Joffrey Ballet and the Company, to Michael Winterbottom's perfect illusion of a docu for In This World, and the non-emphatic attitude of finding the extraordinary to the everyday, and Tom McCarthy's The Station Agent. While CGI-fed forces wave the banner today for The Matrix, The Lord of the Rings, and Pirates of the Caribbean films are being made around the world with largely non-professional casts, staged in real time and with semi-documentary approach. From works by Iranian modern realists to Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation, Peter Mullen's The Magdalene Sisters, and Gus Van Sant's Elephant, certain filmmakers seem content to pull back from conventional storytelling and allow the drama to unfold as if presenting real life. Now, remember, this article was written in 2003. I would say that this was also going on in the 70s. What motivated the filmmakers to refrain from preaching, sentimentalizing, or manipulating? Patty Jenkins, who directed an almost unrecognizable Charlize Theron as real-life serial killer Eileen Wuornos in Monster, offers that it's in response to a market inundated with big-budget sequels and franchise series. It gets so unedgy, it causes this backlash that probably goes too far. I think you can see that in films of the 50s and 70s. Incredibly nuanced films by Elia Kazan and Hal Ashby were at the forefront of a movement towards stories driven by character. In today's Europe, the cause has been most flamboyantly held by Dogma 95, whose code of all things natural and minimal is something Hardwick says she's taken to heart. But her inspiration goes back even earlier. John Cassavetes' films really worked on me, their powerful sense of putting the audience right in the moment with the actors who are almost finding their character as we're watching them, she says. These get me going, as do Rob Nielsen's Heat and Sunlight and Scorsese's early work like Mean Streets, where you feel like you're getting punched in the face. The medium of movies, easily able to record the world in front of our faces, would seem to be the naturalist's natural home. But just as in the rest of the arts, there's always been a big screen battle on two fronts, starting with the Lumiere brothers and Thomas Edison's films of everyday life on one side, and George Méliès's fantasies of flying to the moon on the other. As André Bazin argued in his own gently convincing way, part of what the Italian neorealists, from Roberto Rossellini to Luciano Visconti, were rebelling against in the early 1940s wasn't just their own country's artificial historical epics and superficial comedies, but Hollywood's ultra-stylized trips to lands and characters free from the impact of the Depression and war. If the neorealists' impact was felt in the U.S. in such a desperate 60s work as Kent Mackenzie's Bunker Hill Ode The Exiles and Cassavetes' partly improvised films, then it gained full flower in the 70s cinema of Jerry Schatzberg, Bob Rafelson, and Sidney Lumet. But even though they all yearn for a real world captured on film, the new naturalists hardly resemble each other. The station agent's McCarthy, unlike 13's cinematic equivalent of ADD, aims for a patient study of three characters who take their sweet time to discover and eventually like each other. Noting that he's drawn to Francois Truffaut's early films such as The 400 Blows and Shoot the Piano Player, which let the stories unfold on their own, McCarthy felt the difficulty during shooting to take the time to just linger over a scene or shot and see how real time could play out. But it's hard in America since our country's built on action and revolution. It's hard for us to slow down. Winterbottom says the only fair approach to conveying the desperation of those fleeing third world poverty but trapped in ruthless human trafficking was to draw up a likely scenario for a refugee's flight to the West and cast actual survivors. Casting, in fact, is the key to the naturalistic style, says McCarthy. If you're telling your story with naturalism, it lives or dies by the actors, so the acting seems invisible. Robert Altman, whose 1975 film Nashville seemed to eavesdrop on more than a dozen characters in the world of country music and earned 5 Academy Award nominations in the process, has approached his latest film with the same disregard for Hollywood formula. Even though she is ostensibly the star of the company, Neve Campbell told the director from the outset that she didn't want to be seen as the star on screen. She wanted to be one of the dancers and seamlessly blend into the ensemble, notes Altman, who observes the effect it had on the film's cast of non-acting pros from the Joffrey. I couldn't make the dancers actors, so I had to make the actual actors, Campbell and James Franco, seem like non-actors so they don't stand out. And as I shot group scenes, the dancers never had any idea what their dialogue was going to be, and they almost never knew it was dialogue at all. Which only stresses the paradox of naturalistic movies, of which Altman is one of the grand old foxes. Naturalism never means just making it up on the spot and letting things happen as in real life. Rather, it means carefully contriving everything, from your star to socks in a drawer, so it just seems that way. So, as you can see, there were naturalists in the early 2000s as well. Now, for me, when I directed Free Enterprise, the one movie that I've directed, I insisted, for the most part, to shoot in actual locations. I wanted to go to places that really existed and just use what was there. Now, the lighting was stylized, but the camera work I wanted to be fairly classical and structured, because we didn't have very much time in these places. We went to like 40 locations in 24 days, which was insane. I don't recommend that. I would never do that again. But that was what I was after, a naturalism. People, when we wanted to shoot in Jerry's Deli, we went to Jerry's Deli and shot in Jerry's Deli. Rest in peace, Jerry's Deli. But it created, it's hard to build a realistic set. You can make beautiful sets, but to create one that looks absolutely naturalistic is really hard to do, especially on a low budget. And going to a Jerry's Deli, even what's blurry in the background, the lights hanging from the ceilings, or people, it's hard to build that on a low budget. So we would go and film in real locations, because you want to get that real feel. You want to get that naturalistic verisimilitude feel. Now, if you're shooting mostly in one location, like, say, what we saw recently this weekend with Companion, they're in a house. I would imagine that was a built set. It might not. It might have been a real house that they shot in. I'm not really sure. Maybe it was a one location place. Great location, really added to the realism of the film. Now, the flip side of that is all the fantasy movies that have been coming out in the last 30 years, where there is an over-reliance, in my opinion, on green screen, set extensions, things like that. Obviously, it makes sense in The Lord of the Rings, but the secret to Lord of the Rings was, for every matte painting, they had the actual beautiful New Zealand landscapes that they would either put, like, they would go build, Rohan, they would build Theoden's castle or whatever, his homestead, on top of a real mountain. So you could see that stuff, and when you're intercutting that kind of reality with CG fantasy, like whether you're going to Isengard or Barrydiller, and you've got these CG assisted bigatures or actual matte paintings, if you're setting those things in actual locations, you've done plate photography or whatever, it helps that believability. Also, one of the problems with virtual worlds and a lot of CG assisted shots is you tend to move. The thing about real life, and this is a crazy thing, go with me on this for a minute. We know that films are being, we're not consciously aware of it, even though if you sat down and thought about it, you'd be aware of it. But when you're watching a movie that isn't animated, that's live action, there's a camera there. And everything that you see in front of the camera has been made up. It's as much verisimilitude as you can get. There's a camera there, so you're creating the most realistic, like I always say, the best fiction is the most truthful. That's never more true than movie making. And Lord of the Rings works, or The Matrix works, and all of those movies work because a lot of it had that real world setting. Well, more and more, especially with like the MCU, more and more of those movies are shot on green screens, and sometimes the green screen is the dominating, or now we've got the LED screens, you've got the volume stages and things like that. But there's less and less reality, especially in our fantasy films. And it's kind of by necessity. As our fantasy films are getting even more fantastical, it's harder to use practical, or sometimes it's impossible, so you can't do it. And I totally understand that. Which brings me to another article. And this is sort of, I found this on a website called The Hoya, and Hoya. Again, I don't even know what this website is, but I wanted to read this article because I thought it was a good one. Film and Philosophy, Cinema Verte, and Ecstatic Truth. And this was written by Luke McMahon on November 30th, 2023. Martin Scorsese stirred up controversy in 2019 by calling Marvel films theme parks. He argued that big franchise movies with the main purpose of entertainment were different from true cinema, an art form that, at its best, challenges audiences with complex characters and storylines. Scorsese is the latest in a long history of filmmakers and critics to invoke the notion of true cinema. But beyond its critical or artistic merit, how voracious can a film be? To date, two of the most significant theories have been cinema verite and the ecstatic truth. Although it's difficult to nail down a precise date, the tradition of cinema verite, meaning truthful cinema in French, likely began in 1923 with legendary and foundational director Dziga Vertov's series of visual newsreels of Soviet history, called the Kino Pravda Project. In the following decades, cinema verite developed into a well-respected film tradition noted for its austere, stripped-down documentary-like style. It seeks to approach the ultimate cinematic verity by bringing the medium as close as possible to daily life. Instead of leaning into the multitudes of stylistic possibilities movies uniquely can afford, involving editing, effects, or even the complicated construction of a narrative, cinema verite aspires to the objectivity at the cost of the near elimination of the filmmaker. Of course, the director maintains some control behind the camera, but compared to other film paradigms, especially Auteur theory, which asserts the director as the foremost artistic personality behind a film and thus encourages innovation in the art form, is extremely journalistic and straight-laced. Its strictest adherents argue that the cinematic medium yields even greater objective capabilities than the written word. Thus, in its purest conception, cinema verite portrays non-fiction material as accurately and faithfully to real-life subjects as possible. While the term is often misapplied to any comparatively unvarnished film and the style is rarely used, cinema verite is often esteemed as the most real cinema and stands about as far as possible from Marvel theme parks. And I would say that that cinema verite style is what informed John Cassavetes' work. That's why people like that stuff when you're watching husbands and wives and women on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Not husbands and wives. What's it called? That's the Woody Allen movie. I forget. I have to go look at my Cassavetes box set. Not everyone holds cinema verite to the truest style the medium has to offer, most notably director and documentarian Werner Herzog. While portraying plenty of fictional subjects as well as acting and writing operas and books, Herzog is perhaps most famous for his relationship with the documentary format, one which has garnered him much criticism over his 5 decades of work. He takes a very different approach to cinema verite, sometimes selectively staging or writing scenes and using fake quotes or false description in his documentaries. These practices are in the service of what he calls the ecstatic truth, which transcends the fiction or the factual nature of the story. To Herzog, portraying reality is not as simple as stripping down cinema to its bare bones and least invasive depictive powers. He likens the verite style to a cinematic telephone book, presenting merely a banal truth, one utterly preoccupied with facts. Instead, Herzog seeks to depict the reality underneath, the abstracted sublime that art, albeit with considerable effort and craft, and only with audience participation, can sometimes access. So even in his documentaries, he is not concerned with rigid accuracy, but manipulates the story when necessary in order to furnish the real subjects with an extra dimension of cosmic significance. In other words, the path to the truth behind the story does not necessarily stem from bare factual portrayal. This theory also stands in opposition to Marvel theme parks, as the emotional resonance a film achieves with the ecstatic rejects the MCU model of quick gratification. Whether or not Scorsese would support Herzog's rare but significant manipulations in his documentaries, this ambiguous ultimate sublime that cinema can achieve seems to match what the legendary director sees as true cinema. As mid-budget cinema disappears and the movie-making industry rapidly changes, an effort to generate the ecstatic must be maintained no matter how one goes about depicting it. So, in other words, that naturalism that I am so fond of, that gives me that great charge of verisimilitude, is something that we are kind of losing. Now, in my mind, I love seeing the great big budget fantasy epics that also have their own internal verisimilitude. Just because you're making a fantasy movie doesn't mean you can't have verisimilitude of the fantastic. And I would say Star Wars, the first Star Wars, the original version of Star Wars in 1977, did a pretty good job of that. Because one, it had more sophisticated special effects than we'd ever seen before. The stuff in space gave it a quality and a reality we'd never seen on film. And a dynamic, the way the ships moved and things like, and also there's really interesting stuff. Like when R2 and 3PO jettison from the blockade runner in that escape pod, when they show it blast away from the Tantive, the blockade runner, when they show it blast away, or Tantive, blast away, it looks totally realistic. It almost emulates something we would have seen from the Apollo program. Dun, 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 when it's going down. And we'd never seen that before in a science fiction movie. And there was things like that in Star Wars that created, and everything about it, the dirtied up future worlds, even though they were a long time ago, a galaxy far, far away, you know what I mean. The Death Star interior. Some of it was very impractical. There wasn't a lot of guardrails, but it felt real because these giant sets were expansive. We'd never seen a science fiction movie that was designed this way before. So I maintain that one of the great successes that Star Wars was able to achieve when it came out was it brought people into a world that had total fantastical verisimilitude, which are two words that are sort of diametrically opposing. But the reason Star Wars worked because of how real it felt. And one of the great disappointments of my life was when I went and saw the Star Wars Special Edition in 1997, and it was full of a bunch of CGI because it shattered the verisimilitude. And I understand Lucas wanted to have things like the Rontos and the Jawas and a bunch of shit floating in the air. The problem was, for me, is that stuff it was totally incongruous with what he'd shot before. And it shattered the verisimilitude, and it really put me off. Like, I was really angry about that. And again, Empire Strikes Back. Sure, there were certain matte paintings of Dagobah that you knew were matte paintings, but they really went to a glacier in Norway. They really went to these places. In Cloud City, again, a little bit too fantastical. There was a lot more reliance on matte paintings and things like that, and the colors were different. So you knew that the fantasy realms in Empire were a little bit more fantastical, but you still bought off on it because even though they would give you the exterior shot of Cloud City, when you got into those sets, they felt real. They didn't have a lot of blue screen set extensions. They built those sets, and they felt that way. When you could tell that when you saw them. And one of the reasons Return of the Jedi didn't work as well for me was because you didn't have as much of that verisimilitude. There was when Jabba the Hutt sail barges going over the dunes, you knew that was all in effect, whereas the dunes in Tatooine were real dunes. So there was it changed, and fantasy films have changed as the world has continued to move forward. Now, I'm going to get to Fantastic Four, but you know me. It's observations. Now let me just check and see if anybody is chiming in here. Let me see what anybody may or may not have anything to say, or you do. Oh, people do. Mario Lopez has been a member of the channel for 46 months. Thank you, Mario. Please ask your mother. We'll tell her I was asking after her. I hope she's doing well. Cameron is a new member. He's an imagination. Cameron's become an imagination connoisseur. We have a member chat every other Saturday. We had one last week. Tracy, A World in Pajamas, is here. Says, hey, Rob, how are you? I'm just having my morning coffee talking about realistic people in movies. I'm a fan of Mike Leigh movies. Do you like him? He's a great director without having an Oscar. Yeah, Mike Leigh is a great British director, and he does a lot of improv and things like that with his actors. And he's made great movies. I think maybe the way he works, I don't know, has he achieved the storytelling greatness because of the way he works, that he hasn't made a movie that's hit that hard, but he's been nominated. His films are great. His actors are great. Mike Leigh movies are very much worth checking out. Tracy goes on to ask or say, I watched Hard Truths. It's very good. I like Vera Drake, but I have a soft spot for Peter Liu because my auntie wrote these of the tragedy. Wrote a thesis for the tragedy. Well, that's interesting. That is interesting. Say hi to your auntie for me if she's still around. Yeah, I mean, Mike Leigh's stuff, I have a few Mike Leigh movies, but I think they're an acquired taste. But again, they do encompass that, you've got actors, literally, they're improvising scenes. So there's a lot of verisimilitude happening in those movies. Ben Johnson says that he loves the channel and film advice. Well, thank you. I'm glad you love the channel. That makes me feel good. That means the world to me. Darth Plato. Darth Plato says, "Happy birthday, Rob. If the Strange New World crew took the injection that turned humans into Vulcans, but changed to the aliens from Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, would the Strange New World's crew," okay, this is very funny, "hate and kill each other?" That's a good question. So Darth Plato is bringing up something again. This is why I can't stand modern Star Trek. So we've all seen a clip from season 3 of Strange New Worlds where they take some elixir that transforms members of our principal cast from humans into Vulcans. Now, here's what loses me, and here's why I think modern Star Trek is so terrible. So this is the writers are they're clearly not versed in science fiction, nor have they thought out their own scenario. So if I was suddenly transmuted into, or imagine if you were suddenly transmuted into a Vulcan, you would be physiologically different than a Vulcan, but you weren't brought up as a Vulcan, so you wouldn't think like a Vulcan. Your biology doesn't change who you are or your personality. But the premise of this episode is when you get turned into a Vulcan, suddenly you are a Vulcan. You talk like a Vulcan, you think like a Vulcan. And that is, to me, that's Saturday morning thinking. That's something that would fly on a Saturday morning TV show for kids. It doesn't fly in a thoughtful science fiction context because it doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, the crew is making fun of Spock because he's only half Vulcan. So suddenly they'd become a bunch of racists. It's so awful. I haven't even seen the episode yet, but when they put that out, I'm like, that's why I hate modern Star Trek. That there is no reality, because if you're going to, as I've said a million times on this channel, if you're going to make something fantastical happen, you have to make it believable. If it's not believable, then look, an audience, you can make an audience believe anything, but you have to make the rest of what's going on around that fantastical thing believable too. And for me, I believed in Star Wars until they added all of these CG characters that didn't look like they were real anymore. The design work, I didn't believe them. I didn't believe all that extra stuff. The Jabba the Hutt, the CG on the original Jabba the Hutt scene with Han Solo wasn't good. And so that verisimilitude that Star Wars had was shattered by all of these, and the scenes were so haphazardly done, it looked like a mistake. It felt like a mistake to me. I'm like, why would you do that? And what was interesting is that George Lucas didn't know that. Like, he couldn't see that about his own movie. And as a filmmaker and an editor myself, if you're going to make changes, you still have to make sure that those changes work in the context of the film. And I don't know, it's always perplexed me that how he didn't see that after creating Star Wars. And I lived with Star Wars for 20 years. And when Star Wars was changed after the first 2 decades that it existed, a movie I'd seen more than any other movie in my life, it was jarring, and I don't think it worked. Now, audiences who had never seen the original, I mean, if you think about it, the Star Wars Special Edition is now 28 years old. That version of Star Wars that's been readily available has existed a lot longer than Star Wars existed, the original Star Wars, before it was changed into the Special Edition. So most people are used to it. And if you've grown up in a world where you've already got all the magical bells and whistles, which is what younger generations have, then it doesn't bother them. And also another thing, younger audiences don't know what the kind of verisimilitude is that I'm talking about because they never experienced it. There's a lot more fantastical movies that exist in the world than did when I was a kid. And the ones that I saw when I was a kid, let's face it, it's not like they had the greatest special effects. I like them despite their shortcomings. But now the movies don't have shortcomings. I mean, I remember thinking when I was watching, you get to the late 70s after Star Wars, seeing Alien. You know, you watch Alien now, it's totally believable, except for maybe the CRT 4x3 screens of the computers. But even then, it's an aesthetic choice. It doesn't get in the way. Why? Because they're actual real computer screens. They're not like CG inserts that were put in post. They're on the set, so you can tell they're real. So you buy into it. But you look at a movie like Alien, Alien hasn't aged a day. It's crazy when you watch it. Why? Peak verisimilitude. Peak verisimilitude. And I would say now, one of the things that fascinates me is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And to a certain extent, the DC Universe. Now, I'm going to get into trouble here because I always do. I liked Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. Actually, I liked his entire Man of Steel trilogy. I liked Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. I like Zack Snyder's Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, especially the Ultimate Cut, and I like Zack Snyder's eventual Justice League. The thing about those movies is they do exactly the opposite of verisimilitude. To me, they're very Wagnerian and operatic, and they're very painterly. And when you see all of these things happening, on one hand, the battle over Metropolis in Man of Steel has, in a way, peak verisimilitude. It has. You're seeing what would actually happen if two characters as powerful as Kal-El and Zod were fighting and how horrible it would actually be for humanity. So all of that was very, very cool. And as I said, I love Man of Steel as a science fiction first contact story. I don't think it's a particularly good Superman story. But the visuals are so striking, and Zack Snyder does a lot. I mean, it's a very visual, it's like a superhero tone poem. And those movies are very fun to watch. And he's very good at creating these beautiful Wagnerian tableaus. I mean, you could take almost any frame out of a Zack Snyder superhero movie and paint it on the side of a 70s van, and it would be badass. You know, however, I don't think his movies have charm, and as I've said, joy. People mistake when I say they don't have joy. There are moments of joy in them, but they are not joyous films. I mean, in Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, you literally have Lex Luthor putting a mason jar full of piss in front of Holly Hunter in that Senate hearing. I mean, these are not joyful movies, and they have moments of joy in them, but a lot of people don't understand that. Now, here's the thing. I love the MCU. I love the MCU because the MCU worked because they did a very smart thing. And if you go back to Iron Man 1, watch the first 10 minutes of Iron Man 1, when you see Tony Stark in the back of that Humvee talking to these soldiers, it immediately grounds the whole movie. Tony Stark's character grounds the whole movie. It's because of the way he is portrayed. Yeah, he's a billionaire and a playboy, but we like him not because he's a superhero. We like him because that guy is having a good time. We want to be in his orbit. So, and it's shot in such a way where you believe it. Yes, it's a comic book movie, but it's grounded. For the most part, Iron Man 1 is incredibly grounded. And the journey that you take from Iron Man 1 to Infinity War and Endgame is a masterful journey because every movie, Marvel earned it from us. You know, I always say that a movie gets one big fantastical ask, but they were very, very smart about the way they built up. I mean, that was my, I've said it before a million times. My big question was, how are they going to make us believe that after I saw Iron Man 1, that Thor and Captain America exist in the same universe, much less the Avengers? And the great strength of the MCU is they did just that. And it worked until it didn't work. And I would say that for me, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was broken, irrevocably broken, by the addition of things like the TVA and the quantum realm. I mean, the quantum realm was cool in Endgame, but when you got to Quantum Mania, the whole thing went off the rails. Too far. You went too far. And the TVA was too far. The concept of the TVA was too far. Because let's just say that there was a company like, or a place like the TVA. What they did was they made it a parody. They leaned into the Terry Gilliam Brazil aspects of it. And the whole idea of the TVA became a comedic commentary on our corporate world. So it became satire. The entire existence of the TVA, even though it was in the comics, the entire existence of the TVA in the MCU made it impossible to believe in the MCU the way the MCU was carefully burned or seared into our imaginations. And they earned our belief with each successive film. And that's why when I get to Infinity War and Endgame, I love those movies so much, because they're balls-to-the-wall fantasy epics that are populated with a bunch of characters that are grounded. You believe them. Because all of those characters have earned your love. All of them. Even Brie Larson's Captain Marvel at that point. But when you get to the TVA, you don't believe, a character named Mobius, come on. Nothing in the TVA is real. And then when you meet He Who Remains, and nothing that happens in the Loki TV series, season 2 is okay, but you're in total fantasy land. There's nothing that grounds the world anymore. Even Asgard was relatively grounded. Thor Love and Thunder, no. It spun off into La La Land. Quantumania, La La Land. I liked Shang-Chi quite a bit because it was playing off a certain the wuxia movies, the Chinese, so I bought into it, and you had the nice sequence in San Francisco first, so okay, I'll buy into that. But even with the Eternals couldn't, the fantasy elements, the deviant elements didn't really work, and I like the Eternals, but too much to ask. So phase 5, 4, 5, 6, whatever phase we're going into, it wasn't grounded anymore. Now, I do like the theories that have been spinning around the web that we're going to meet our Doctor Doom, and it's a retcon, but he's been behind a lot of the stuff that's going on. And if you watch a few of the online theory videos, let's just say some of them are closer to the truth than they might realize. But that's all I can say about that. But I think what they're doing is quite interesting, and they might be able to redeem a lot of what I have disliked about the latter phases of the MCU. Now, Fantastic Four and James Gunn's Superman. The thing about Zack Snyder's Superman is I think it appeals to a certain kind of person looking for a certain kind of thing. And what they're not looking for is any naturalism. And the naturalism, they'll always point to the most naturalistic scenes like I made a point online to say last week that one of my favorite scene in any Superman movie is the scene where Christopher Reeve meets Lois Lane on the roof of her house, of her apartment, or outside, or patio outside, and they have a conversation, because it encompasses a lot of film history. It's not just a scene between Superman and Lois Lane. It's a scene between two people meeting. It goes back to screwball comedy. There's a lot happening in that one scene that's charming. Now, is it cool? No, but it's charming. It has heart, and there's joy in it. People were. I had guys coming at me going, "Oh, it's pervy. The underwear thing is pervy," And I'm like, okay, not to a human adult. It's not pervy. It's a funny scene. It's playful. It's seductive. It's also showing you the extent of his powers, which is a really fun way to have him say, "I can't see through lead," and as soon as she walks out, pink. It becomes. There's so much at play. There's seriousness, there's humor, there's the actual interest in you're finding out about the rules of Superman because of Lois's questions. She becomes us. It's a great scene on many different levels. Now, is it cool? Is it Wagnerian? Is it operatic? No. And, somebody put up a poll today. Which scene do you like better? The interview scene when Superman's incarcerated and he sits down with Amy Adams and the S says hope. I understand that scene won over the Margot Kidder Superman scene by a wide margin. I understand that because as a fantasy film fan growing up, when I was 12 years old, I would have picked that scene 4 Ways Till Sunday. But that scene doesn't do nearly as much as the scene with Lois Lane and Superman from Donner's original film. Again, it's all cool and it gives you joy in one particular way. It's not very dimensional. It's not very nuanced. It's also not very human. It's storytelling shorthand. All of Zack Snyder's superhero movies, they look badass. I really like them. But we're imbuing these scenes with meaning because he's put on screen these characters in a very particular way. But it's not very human. It's all metaphoric. It's very godlike. Whereas if you look at, and people would say this, and this is what I don't understand, James Gunn's Superman, in my estimation, and I can't have an opinion about James Gunn's Superman because I haven't seen it. I don't know what's happening in that movie. I do know one thing, and the trailers sort of confirm this. That movie takes place in a fantasy realm where superheroes are real. So what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to make us, the audience, believe in that world. We're going to have to believe in the world that James Gunn's Superman takes place in, which means they're going to have to establish it for us. So when the movie opens, whether it's through a montage or whatever instance, whatever happens, they're going to have to show us that world and make us believe. And I'm excited to see how they do that because, we've never seen that before. We've never seen the opposite. We've always seen these grounded superhero movies, at least since the dawn of X-Men, maybe go back to far as Blade, going back to 98, but even Blade's pretty fantastical. But X-Men beginning at Auschwitz, that was the grounded era of superhero movies. Yes, you had Donner's Superman. Tim Burton's Batman takes place in an Anton First directed industrial hellscape that we know that takes place in Batman world. It's not in our world. Whereas superheroes take place starting in 2000 in quote unquote the real world. Although I would argue that Sam Raimi's Superman movie or Spider-Man movies take place in more of a movie realm. But what the MCU did, at least when it started, was it had the perfect balance. You had Fantasyland. For whatever reason, I don't know why they're always squelching my streams, but you believed, and the MCU had the perfect balance of fantasy and reality, and it was in a way I would say the same way that Back to the Future has that perfect balance of yes, it's a fantasy, yes, it's a concoction, it's a confection. But because Marty McFly is relatively grounded and his family's grounded, you can get away with more. And it's really hard to do that, to create that Back to the Future-esque tone. Iron Man 1 does that. A lot of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies did that up until Spider-Man Far From Home. I think James Gunn's Superman is going to do that as well. It's going to be more of a Back to the Future kind of a superhero film where there's lots of fantasy happening. Now, what was really interesting today when I was watching the Fantastic Four teaser, and it was just a teaser, I really liked what I saw. It didn't tell us anything. It didn't tell us anything about the story. But what it did give us was the tone and the milieu. And it can go either way. It still has to be a great story. But I like that they're planting their flag very different from anything we've seen before with the four previously existing, the Corman Fantastic Four movie and then the 3 Fox Fantastic Four films. This is very different. Going back to the 1960s, that rocket they showed was like right out of First Spaceship in Venus. It just the tri-motored. It was right out of the 60s, 50s, and 60s. I love that so much. And that's what was really interesting. I love the tone. I love the look. It harked back to the New York scenes, the early New York scenes in First Avenger, which I think is really, really cool. I know it takes place in a different universe, but I really enjoy the tone. For me, jury's still out. It was a teaser. The one thing I would say is I'm still not convinced about the cast, to be honest. Pedro Pascal, I like him, but now it's because he's so ubiquitous. He's like everywhere, but he always just kind of looks like Pedro Pascal. And we've now seen things like Mad Men, which take place in the late 50s, early 60s, that have that. I mean, the casting was impeccable. The clothes were impeccable. The people they cast in Mad Men were very evocative of the time. You believe that those characters lived in that time. It was impeccably cast. This cast in Fantastic Four, while I'm not sold yet. Got to see the movie, but I would say that I'm not going to rip a movie apart that I haven't seen. I've seen all of 1 minute and 36 seconds of the Fantastic Four in a disjointed manner. There's nothing I can tell you about the movie other than I love Michael Giacchino's score, and I have no idea where the movie is going, coming. I don't know I have no idea what it's like. I have no sense of it. Just like I don't have any sense of James Gunn's Superman. I think both Superman and Fantastic Four have a certain quality to them. They're both kind of doing the same things. They're taking place in Fantasyland, so it's going to be incumbent upon those movies to give us the reality and make us believe. And I think that we've already seen James Gunn do that with his Guardians of the Galaxy characters and the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker. So he's going to have to do it more than he's ever done it before, but I'm really curious and anxious to see what he's going to do. And those movies are going to come out within weeks of each other. So we're going to be comparing and contrasting them. And it's going to be really interesting. I'm really excited and interesting to see how it's going to go. I don't want to do battle with people online talking about, oh, this sucks. I hate this look. Look, it has to, the clothes have to fit the man or the woman. And the story and the milieu and the mise en scène and all of that has to fit the film that we're going to see. I have no sense of what that film is yet because I haven't seen it. So I can't say anything other than the fact that I'm excited to see that film. I've got another article to read. Let's see what you guys are saying. Akana says, in that article, they say the auteur can only be the director. So what does that say of writers like Tony Gilroy, who has said he explicitly directs through his scripts? Well, Tony Gilroy is an auteur. He writes and he directs. So, I mean, to me, look, this is a good question, actually. I really like this question. When you are directing something, now, if you're directing something that you have not written yourself and you've been gifted, like I can speak to this right now because I have been working with 10 scripts that Max Allan Collins wrote adapting his novel True Detective. Now, he wrote those scripts, and those are words on paper, and even though it's only an audio drama, everything else, every other decision is made by me in terms of casting, in terms of what sound effects to use, how to put it all together. If you don't like True Noir, you can't blame Max because his scripts are great, but you can blame me for not liking certain aspects of it. Maybe the pacing isn't right for you. Maybe the sound, maybe it's too loud, whatever. A director has to make 10,000 decisions. And if you don't have a good, strong director working on a film or a television show, now, television is a bit different because unless you have a director that's going to direct like when you have a director that directs like all the episodes in a mini series, like the first season of True Detective, believe it or not. When you have that director directing all of the episodes, it becomes an auteurist piece. But on a TV show, they establish it's a writer's medium because the director and the cinematic nature, you're still shooting it, it's still cinema, but the language of cinema is less important than the story is on TV. You want to make sure the story is well told, don't get me wrong, but you're not going to see all these beautiful arty shots on TV because that's not how TV production works. But an auteur, the director, anybody who's directing still has to make a bunch of decisions. See, when you do a TV show too, the director doesn't sit in the edit bay. You do a pass and you leave. You do your director's pass and then you hand it all over and the producers finish the show. But on a film, it's the opposite. The director's with the show, well, if he's a good director and doesn't get kicked out of the edit bay, is with the film the whole time. And so, like with me, I've been crafting all of True Noir with my sound team and myself. There's nobody between us. It's all and yet I won't go around saying that I'm the auteur of True Noir, because it started with the writing. True Noir is more like a TV show than it is a movie. But because it's an audio drama and you can't see anything, what I'm doing is a lot more important, because seeing things it would make it much easier. But it's a really great question. So Tony Gilroy is both a writer-director. So when he writes something, and he's going to direct it, he already knows when he's written a script that he's directing how he's going to shoot it. He knows everything about how that movie is going to work because he's seen it in his head. That's what a great screenwriter does. So, that's a very good question. I really enjoyed that. B Things says, I agree that naturalism is good, but I also really appreciate the films of Tim Burton or Wes Anderson, which are almost intentionally unnaturalistic. Yeah, well, that's true too. But the thing is, that was their intent. You know, films like Wes Anderson's, his like center framing and all that, that's a very Wes Anderson trait. You know that he's working in a certain stylistic way of telling a story, but that's his way. Same with Tim Burton. And I would say that, you know, Tim Burton's storytelling, it's more like a fairy tale. And he sets out to do that thing, and he makes us believe. And that's very intentional. But I would also say that Wes Anderson and Tim Burton also have their own version of verisimilitude. Wes Anderson, he still has to make you believe in his stories. Even though the way he shoots them is very constructed, he still makes you believe in that way of storytelling. And that means all these things have to work on all cylinders. Like I could never direct a Wes Anderson movie. I could never do that. I don't or tell that kind of a story. I don't really have it in me to do something like that. I have fantasy stories. I have a big fantasy story. A big fantasy movie I'd like to make. Not a Lord of the Rings movie, but a movie that's very fantastical, that's set in the real world. But it's not like a Wes Anderson movie, and it's not like a Tim Burton movie. Those are different. But very, very good question. Jurassic Joey says, let's have a stalker watch party. Laugh out loud. Just kidding. I mean, we could. I think half of us would fall asleep. But yes, Stalker is Tarkovsky's science fiction movie based on the Stragatsky brothers' Roadside Picnic, and it's definitely an art piece, and it's certainly not for everyone. I would not recommend Stalker to many people. Let me put it that way. You'd have to be a very discerning person. A World in Pajamas, Tracy says, I've got to walk the dog and I'm off to uni. I'm a fan of European cinema because you still get that realism. Although they were made before I was born. Fan the old kitchen sink dramas, i.e. Kess. You're a fan of the old kitchen sink dramas? Look, I like the Ealing Studios movies, the kind of those comedies like Kind Hearts and Coronets and things like that. I wouldn't say that they're naturalistic, but I really like them. Tracy says, sorry for all the typos. The coffee hasn't woke me up yet, but the cold weather will when I go out. Haha. Take care, Rob. Have a great week. Well, Tracy, it's always good to have you here. S. Beam, who's been a member for 48 months, says, what's up, Rob and chat? Captain Robert April's been a member of the channel for 30 months. And Tracy says, she has one more thing to say. Before I go, I forgot to say Gattaca is probably one of the most realistic sci-fi movies ever made. It's got a big following in the science fiction community. I love Gattaca. I mean, you know, there's a lot of science fiction movies in the 21st century. I think was Gattaca. Is it 99? I think it's probably 2000. But Gattaca is a great film. So is movies like Children of Men, Her. Spike Jonze is Her. There's a science fiction movie called Enara. That's the Swedish film I always talk about that I love. But there's a lot of Gravity. I mean, Gravity, even though it's fantastical, and there's a lot of things that happen in it that are dubious in terms of whether they'd happen that way. But they have a naturalism, a verisimilitude. Ridley Scott's The Martian has verisimilitude. You know, you really believe that. Darth Plato says that that the Fantastic Four trailer reminds him of the Jetsons. Yeah, I mean, the thing about the Fantastic Four trailer is they picked a thing to do. They picked a tone. It's not surprising Matt Shackman has done that. You know, it's got that WandaVision going into another time and recreating it. And we'll see how that works. I mean, how are they going to incorporate that into the MCU? It's going to be very interesting to see. And will the movie live up to that? Hard to say. But I'm there for it. I can't wait to see what they do with it. And again, I couldn't really tell. I like the look of the film. It's very interesting because in terms of verisimilitude, I've heard a lot of people say that they don't like the look of the movie. Like they're like, I don't like the look of the thing. And I think, you know, it's not that the CG is bad. I think what people are responding to is the color palette. Like Darth Plato says, it looks like the Jetsons. Somebody said it looks like an animated movie. Well, it's got that incredibly stylized sort of futuristic look of Tomorrowland. You know, it has that what we thought the future was going to look like in 1958. It kind of looks that way. It's their retro 60s thing going on. And I think that everything about it, it's so, especially it's the opposite of what Zack Snyder was doing. Totally the opposite. And I understand people, it's jarring for people. But what's frustrating for me is that being that I'm so old, is that I've seen so many different things before. So I'm perfectly willing to open my mind, you know, like Quado would ask me in Total Recall, open your mind, Bobby. I would. I'm opening my mind because I've seen all that, you know, to understand if you know mid-century architecture or you know mid-century furniture and you look at those sets, you have to smile. But then again, if you go too far, you wind up in TVA land where I just don't believe anything that happens with the Time Variance Authority at all. Because none of it makes it, because the place, the TVA was conceived as it's a goof. It's a goof. It's conceived as a parody of a workplace that we've seen parodied in things like Terry Gilliam's Brazil or things like that. So they did not make me believe in the Time Variance Authority. As a matter of fact, I think the TVA and the multiverse thing could have worked. I wish the TVA was not a part of it. I think that really put the kibosh on everything. Thomas Logan has a good theory. Or Darth Plato says, the Fantastic Four, already said that. Thomas Logan says, I'm convinced John Malkovich is present-day Franklin Richards. The Fantastic Four probably get lost during Launch 2 and due to time dilation, return to their Earth 70 years later. I love that idea. I think that's a great idea. And again, brings in the reality of it, can make you believe. Akana comes back and says, I like how Fantastic Four is looking, but I will say that I'm a bit disappointed with the look of the city. I was hoping for a more Tomorrowland look in its look. Yeah, I could see that. I think we might see more of that. I mean, I asked the question today, you know, you do see what looks like kind of New York, but then when you see the Baxter building, it looks futuristic, the cars. But you're right. I mean, I think we're going to get more of that. We'll have to see if it takes place on an alternate world, how that's all going to look. It's going to be interesting. Now, I have a third article to read, and this article kind of feeds in to what I wanted to talk about in terms of movies that I grew up watching and why it refers back to the film business and lessons we can learn from the 1970s. And this was an article that was in the Washington Post, and it was written it was published July 23rd, 2020. And it was written by Anne Hornaday. And the film industry is in crisis. It can learn a lot from the 1970s. Again, this was written 5 years ago. So let's dive into this, and all three of these articles kind of work together. Certain years leave a permanent imprint on your movie memories. 50 years ago, 10-year-old me was scheming my way into the R-rated hippie counterculture documentary Woodstock. That winter, I would beg to see Love Story, a handsome, deliciously weepy romance featuring Peyton Place heartthrob Ryan O'Neal. Meanwhile, my Republican parents went to see MASH, and Patton, 4 stars, just like the General, and we all piled into the Ford Falcon to watch Airport, an overstuffed star vehicle with Burt Lancaster, Dean Martin, Gene Seberg, Helen Hayes. That was part soap opera, part disaster flick, and all high-grade Hollywood cheese. Those are some of the biggest hits of 1970 with Ryan's Daughter, Tora, 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 Little Big Man, Catch-22, and The Owl and the Pussycat rounding out the top 10. Largely thanks to a breakout performance from its leading actress Ally McGraw, Love Story would reign supreme as the biggest movie of the year. But asked recently to reflect on the film that made her a global phenomenon, McGraw was less interested in Love Story than the company it kept, a remarkably pluralistic collection in style, spirit, and intent. What I love about that list of films, she said, is that nothing has anything in common with the other 9. Reappraising 1970 isn't just a matter of dewy-eyed nostalgia. The year and the decade it launched feels singularly germane to the present day. Consider that a half-century ago, Hollywood was on the brink of potential extinction, brought on by stodgy, big-budget bombs, competition from television, and a calcified production system unprepared to meet the expectations of a new, younger market. Thanks to sheer desperation and resourceful responses to it, the ensuing decade came to be known as one of the most creatively rich eras in American cinema. Today, American cinema is again in rough waters. Audiences are staying away from the theaters in droves while voracious streamers prey on weakened studios. The social change that has roiled a polarized country is reverberating in Hollywood, where the old ways no longer work and the traditional gatekeepers are being forced to hand over the keys. As an industry and an art form struggle to adopt or adapt in the midst of a global pandemic, a technological revolution, and calls for wider representation that have reached critical mass, the question is, can the 70s teach a new generation how to save the movies one more time? Good junk. The answer depends on what lessons we learn and unlearn. Thanks in part to Peter Biskind's book, Easy Riders, Raging Bulls. By the way, everyone should read that if you're a movie fan. A mythology has formed around the 1970s that has assumed liturgical infallibility. Thanks to the renegades such as Dennis Hopper, Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and their cohorts, the artistically audacious, sometimes self-destructive era produced an unprecedented canon of classics, many of them steeped in stick-it-to-the-man eccentricity, wary paranoia, and subversive sexuality and violence. The 1970s, in this telling, lasted roughly from 1967 to 1975, when Jaws changed the game and turned Hollywood into a business more interested in selling toys and Happy Meals than making good movies. I've always disagreed with that. It just changed the kind of movies that were being made. More escapist fare. That's part of the picture. But pull back the lens, and the 70s are amazing, not only because of the movie brats who briefly took control, but because of the period's, and this is the important part, nearly infinite variety in genre, tone, audience appeal, and subject matter. It was a time of Mean Streets, The Poseidon Adventure, American Graffiti, and Last Tango in Paris, Airport sequels, and Aguirre, The Wrath of God, edgy political thrillers, socially aware satires, and mainstream melodramas managed to coexist with B-movies, porn, and Warholian provocations. Regardless of their artistic aspirations, most were enormously entertaining. Some of it was the most remarkable movies ever made, observes Lee Grant, who won an Oscar for her performance in Shampoo, one of the most famous films of the era, and some of it was good junk. That eclectivism would help define the next 10 years, when movies as diverse as Midnight Cowboy, The French Connection, The Last Picture Show, and All the President's Men played alongside Last Tango in Paris and Lady Sings the Blues, midnight movies from John Waters, and a clutch of Mel Brooks comedies. And that doesn't include the micro-budgeted indies, such as the 1970 Gem in the Rough Joe, about a vigilante white supremacist that became sleeper hits. The fact that so many different kinds of movies manage to connect with audiences attests to the fact that instinct, taste, and hard work were prized over formula. It wasn't like, wow, wait till you see Love Story. It's going to break all records, McGraw recalls. Smart producers who were running the major movie companies, including her then husband Robert Evans, took chances on people we'd never heard of, like me, and just made the best movie they could. And if it made a ton of money, everybody was ecstatic. Well, that's true. I hate this. I got to turn this off. Today, of course, Love Story would more likely be made by a Netflix or the Hallmark Channel than a big studio. But at the height of the 70s, prestige and profits weren't mutually exclusive. And the idea of a blockbuster was far more expansive and less infantilizing than it was destined to become. Peter Bart was a reporter for the New York Times when he was hired by Bob Evans, who was running Paramount Pictures, with one elegantly simple mandate: buy accessible books and merge them with interesting young directors. The art plus accessibility recipe met with smashing success during his tenure at Paramount, which essentially became a director's company, according to Peter Bart. Some of the movies he would help put together included Chinatown, Goodbye Columbus, Downhill Racer, Harold and Maude, and Rosemary's Baby, a horror film that gimmick meister William Castle was intending to make when Bart suggested an emerging Polish auteur named Roman Polanski. At the time, Coppola was making lightweight movies like the coming-of-age comedy You're a Big Boy Now. What would happen, Bart recalls asking himself, if he was doing something more consequential? What happened was The Godfather, a project Bart and Evans purchased as a 60-page manuscript from Mario Puzo. A sprawling gangland saga about fathers, sons, mobsters, and post-war America, The Godfather started as something of a flyer, matching Coppola to a property he was initially skeptical about and casting the legendary Marlon Brando opposite a relative rookie named Al Pacino. The film turned out to be an enormous success, like Love Story, in large part thanks to clever cross-promotion with the best-selling book that Evans and Bart commissioned from Puzo's outline. The Godfather still held pride of place as the era's biggest blockbuster 3 years later when Jaws quickly out-earned it, eventually making more than $100 million at the box office. In 1977, Star Wars would up that ante even more, solidifying Hollywood's addiction to summer tentpoles, metastasizing budgets and merchandise as the key to billion-dollar paydays. But what succeeding generations of studio executives failed to grasp, and what has resulted in today's bloated, hopelessly bifurcated movie culture, is what defines our cultural touchstones. The reason people went to Jaws in 1975 might have been to see a monster movie, but the reason they went back, and the reason we still love it in 2020, is that it was less about the shark than it was the guys in the boat. The visuals and childlike nostalgia in Star Wars might have been fun, but its lasting appeal is in its memorable characters and traditional storytelling. That fateful misunderstanding raises a question for the ages. What might American film culture look like if the lesson learned by Hollywood in the 1970s wasn't that surefire success was dependent on spandex and spectacle, but on richly detailed, character-driven storytelling about adults doing recognizably human things on planet Earth? The thing that Jaws and The Godfather have in common, Bart observes, is that both were conceived as rather low-budget experimental movies. Here's the thing about Easy Rider, Raging Bulls. There's usually precious little room for women on the bike or in the ring. The prevailing narrative notwithstanding, women did make movies in the 1970s. Joan Micklin Silver directed Hester Street and Chilly Scenes of Winter, and Elaine May's oeuvre of the period, A New Leaf, The Heartbreak Kid, and Mikey and Nicky, has recently been rediscovered, as has Barbara Loden's lost 1970 classic Wanda. It was easier for women to find purchase in documentary filmmaking, where artists including Madeline Anderson, Barbara Koppel, Charlotte Zwerin, and Claudia Weil were coming into their own as nonfiction directors. In 1975, Weil had just made a documentary about China with Shirley MacLaine when she received a grant from the American Film Institute to make a short film. She hired Vicky Poland to write a script about the friendship between two women and what happens when one of them gets married. A story featuring someone who was not usually a protagonist, someone who was offbeat, game Jewish, and not conventionally pretty. The resulting film, Girlfriends, which I actually own, Melanie Mayron delivers a wryly amusing performance as a struggling photographer navigating rejection and romance in New York. The film was a hit at festivals in Rotterdam and Cannes in 1978 and did modestly well when it opened in theaters. It continues to be rediscovered, most recently by such latter-day fans as Nicole Holofcener, Lena Dunham, and Greta Gerwig, who praised it last year as crucial to her development as a writer-director. I'd never seen someone take female friendship seriously like that, Gerwig said of Girlfriends. She showed something I knew and said it's worth making a movie about. The trajectory of Girlfriends reflects another forgotten truth about the 1970s, that it was a strong decade for female-centered movies, including Jane Fonda starring in Klute, Coming Home, and The China Syndrome, and hits such as Annie Hall, The Turning Point, and An Unmarried Woman. Claudine, starring Diane Carroll as a single mother of 6 kids being wooed by a sanitation worker played by James Earl Jones, is another forgotten gem of the era, a warm comedy drama from 1974 that bursts with humor, struggle, tough love, and middle-age romance. The emotional milieu is instantly recognizable to Lawrence Hilton Jacobs, who played the title character's eldest son and who, like his character, grew up in New York as part of a large working-class family. Claudine was a hit, Jacobs says, but it was swamped by such movies as Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song and Shaft. Too often, these movies didn't get the attention they deserved, Jacobs says about mainstream movies about black life, because blaxploitation films could be made quicker and they made money faster. The long-term result is that Claudine gets left out of the 70s canon, while the blaxploitation aesthetic, tawdry, hypersexualized, extravagantly violent, continues to be affectionately quoted along with other style points of the time. Filmgoers old enough to recognize the trashed-out streets of Joker or the magic hour haze of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood knew that Todd Phillips and Quentin Tarantino were paying homage to the 70s, which are stylistic catnip to filmmakers. Homage can take the form of cool understatement, as in the tightly coiled dramas Michael Clayton and Spotlight, or it can be pure pastiche, as in the lurid B-movie excesses of The Love Witch and Luca Guadagnino's remake of the 1977 camp classic Suspiria. It's not a camp movie. But the referential feedback loop has also resulted in an unfortunate trope in which dark equals deep, brutality equals maturity, and cynicism equals moral seriousness. Let me just read that one more time, because there's nothing more true today than this. But the referential feedback loop has also resulted in an unfortunate trope in which dark equals deep, brutality equals maturity, and cynicism equals moral seriousness. I would say it all equals meme culture. And that's why people think Zack Snyder's Superman is somehow one for the ages. The visual and tonal cues generations of 70s imitators have used to signal importance and sophistication weren't self-conscious flourishes at the time as much as reflection of the filmmaker's reality. We were living the fight, Lee Grant says of Robert Towne, Hal Ashby, and Warren Beatty, who wrote, directed, produced, and starred in Shampoo. These were very sophisticated rebels. They knew the past, they were grabbing a hold of their power, and kind of making over a new world. 5 years later, Grant co-starred in Ashby's directorial debut, The Landlord, a coruscating satire about a wealthy white man, Beau Bridges, who tries to gentrify a Brooklyn apartment building that was astonishingly ahead of its time in addressing race, class, unexamined privilege, and colorism within the black community. As confrontational and daring as Get Out and Sorry to Bother You would be a generation later, The Landlord occupies a particularly vertiginous high wire, which is just where Ashby wanted to be, according to Grant. That's where he lived and breathed. Even more important, the audience followed him there. The only way you pull an audience into a movie theater now is with these superhero movies, Grant says sadly. Good against evil, everybody left or right decides they're Superman, and the right's the enemy of the left's the enemy, and it satisfies all and makes billions. Grant identifies what might be the most salient reason the 1970s succeeded, which has less to do with auteurs and actors and more to do with the audience itself. Although the most conventional movies of the 1970s wound up coaxing middle-aged viewers away from their televisions, a more adventurous generation, well-educated, trained by years of watching television and perhaps 1 or 2 college film courses, was ready to meet just about any movie halfway, whether it was a conventional boy meets girl story, an unconventional boy falls in love with a septuagenarian story, or an X-rated stranger meets stranger in a Paris apartment story. Today, the corporate aversion to risk has resulted in a form of cultural amnesia. Hollywood is still matching interesting young artists with accessible material, like Black Panther, but less in the spirit of discovery than producing predictable, crushingly repetitive products for a global market. And moviegoers behave accordingly, forgetting that some of the most successful and beloved films in history were anything but guarantees. With theaters closed by a pandemic and filmgoers finding movies to watch at home, we found we can still be surprised. Witness such virtual cinema hits as the Brazilian political satire Bakaru and the Icelandic drama A White, White Day, and why we still crave variety. When Netflix recently revealed its 10 most popular original films, the collection of action, horror, broad comedy, and oh yeah, Scorsese's The Irishman was mostly good, or at least mediocre, junk. But art and accessibility still work, as Gina Prince Blythewood is proving with the record-breaking success of The Old Guard, a comic book fantasy that is violent and escapist, but also feminist, multiracial, and emotionally grounded. The biggest hit in a newly reopened theater in Europe and Japan this summer, Greta Gerwig's Little Women, which could be described as the girlfriends of its day. With studio releases indefinitely delayed, Hollywood is understandably preoccupied with how movies will get made and under what conditions. An equally sobering question is whether a post-coronavirus protocol will make Hollywood's current model, making CGI spectacles and cartoons for multiplexes and saving human-scale movies for awards season, art houses, and streaming sites, will become even more siloed. If the 1970s taught us anything, it's that audiences will reward films that take risks, especially when they strive for excellence, engage human values, and meet their moment. But first, we need to reclaim our power to demand them. So as you can see, all of these articles, what I was hoping to talk about is the relevance of our current cinematic landscape. And what does it mean? I have a theory, an overall theory that I wanted to throw out to you guys. If you look at the movies that were made in the 70s, what we were originally talking about, Black Sunday by John Frankenheimer, and I brought up the Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. We don't live as much as human beings in the real world as we used to. We live in a meme world. Now, sure, people still have to pay their bills. People still have to put a roof over their heads and take care of their families and do all of those things. But we're less and less a part of the actual real world around us than we are looking at our black mirrors all day long. We're not living our lives the way that we used to. We're not going out into the world. I mean, we've seen on a number of levels. I've even covered on this show that Atlantic article, The Unsocial Generation. Or the Antisocial Generation? Was that the title of the article? Who I heard the author of that article speak on NPR last week. We're not going out. We're not living lives. We don't even want to do that anymore. And what was really interesting was that the movies that I love about the 70s, even great genre movies like The Parallax View, which is a lot of where the X-Files, where Chris Carter was coming from with the X-Files, is rooted in not just Kolchak the Night Stalker, but in The Parallax View. And when I talk about movies in the 70s seeming like they were made by and they were populated by adults, what I really mean to say is they're populated by people that were out living their lives. We didn't have social media, so we didn't sequester ourselves at home. We were out living. We were out getting up to some shenanigans. People got up to a lot of shenanigans. They understood how the messy nature of adult relationships. I mean, now you read stories about hookup culture. You see people talking about dating, and I think I'm watching like a 13-year-old talking about this stuff. I'm like, are there any adults in the room anymore? We have been completely infantilized as a culture. And this coming from, look around me. I'm an aging man-child, but I've also, like my movie diet or my movie palate, and I think maybe my friend Rob G and I are going to start a show that was derived from the conversation. And it would be, since we're two Robs, it'd be Robservation Square presents Cinema Palette. And we'll talk about, I mean, we got into a long conversation about Kieslowski because I had brought up Red, White, and Blue, the trilogy. And I was telling him, you got to watch The Double Life of Veronique, and he was working his way through the films of Ingmar Bergman. And, you watch these films, and it does seem like our culture across the board has a lot less seriousness and a lot less maturity in it on every level. Certainly politically. We've reduced everything down to, I like you or I hate you. It's all the Hatfields and the McCoys in whatever relationship you want to call it. It's crazy. And movies used to be about adult themes and the adult world. And even movies that are set in the adult world are almost constructs, because I don't think there's enough going on in most of our lives that we actually can have movies like Clute anymore. Not to say that we're not getting great stuff. We still are getting great stuff. Look, I maintain, and I talked about this, I loved Companion. I think it's a damn shame Companion didn't make $50 million this weekend. Is it a B movie? Absolutely. But it's an extraordinarily well done B movie. It's a lot of fun. You've got movies like The Brutalist out in theaters. Hugely ambitious. Thomas Logan will tell you how great it is. He's seen it twice. That, I think, is an example of an adult movie getting made, but they're so few and far between now. I mean, it's interesting. We can't even allow an actress, the first trans actress might have won an Academy Award, but because people were offended by some old tweets she made, people can't understand that adults are complex. They say stupid shit all the time, but what are we going to do? Pillory people for something they said 10 years ago? Not only do we pillory them, and that we take great pleasure in doing so. I mean, why should somebody who made certain tweets 10 years ago because they offended a bunch of people, and maybe they were in poor taste, but does that affect the quality of their work? I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of bad people in the world who've done a lot of bad things that do need to get canceled. But there are other people that human folly is human folly. And, I'm not supporting those things. But I think that we are, we as a culture, especially movie culture, I think that movie analysis and what film Twitter and what YouTube punditry it has been reduced to. I mean, you watch a 1 minute and 37-second trailer of Fantastic Four today, and there's already people talking about how much it sucks. Well, what the fuck do you know? You've not seen the movie, and it might well suck. It might well suck, but why go into it wanting it to suck? I really want every movie that gets made to be great. I wanted Star Trek Section 31 to be great. But the people that were making it, I had no faith in them because they've been making shitty movies since 2009 and shitty Star Trek TV shows since 2017. But the thing is, the Marvel Cinematic Universe used to be the Tiffany standard of superhero movies. And they're finally dipping their own toes into the Fantastic Four pool, which they've never done before. I'm hoping it's good. I want to return to form. I want to feel the way I felt when I saw the first Avenger, which I really like. I don't understand that. Why have we, and I'm part of this community as well. Why are we waiting for things to fail? Why are we going to war over different iterations of Superman? Well, look, it's so funny because I grew up in a world where I loved Superman the movie and I loved Superman 2. And then it's like, what fuckhead made Superman 3? Have you guys ever seen Superman 3? I lived through a world where you have Christopher Reeve in the third, and then Canon Films bought the rights to the Superman movies and made Superman 4 the quest for fucking peace. I mean, I lived through this. I'm like, what the hell happened? What happened? But I still went into those movies wanting them to be good. I had no idea the depths with which those movies could fall. I went through that. And I too, imagine if you're a fan of Superman, Donner's Superman, and then you're a fan of Superman 2. Even though Richard Lester, it was a little goofy. But Superman 3, I remember sitting in that theater perplexed going, who thought of this? Like, it has one great scene where when Superman is fighting evil, the two, he's having the battle within himself. That was a cool scene. But the rest of that movie, I mean, Richard Pryor skis off a building. What the hell? And that was perplexing back then. Like, I just didn't know. But at least I waited to see a movie before, I just think though that it's odd that we have taken a position where, look, if people in the past have given us a lot, there's a lot more. I love James Bond movies, but I would dare say there's probably more James Bond movies that aren't very good than there are James Bond movies that are good. I only liked one of Daniel Craig's 5 James Bond movies. Only one. And I'm a Quantum of Solace apologist. I did not like Skyfall. I did not like Spectre. And I certainly did not like what Cary Fukunaga did with No Time to Die. But I went into all those movies wanting to love them. I did. But then I can come out and then I can hate them if they're hot garbage. But I don't understand. If you like Superman as a character, why don't you go into every Superman project wanting it to be good? Superman and Lois. That was a really good show. Had a great ending. At first I was a little dubious. I've been dubious with a lot of the CW stuff. But I thought they did a really great job. That was a great Superman show. That is very, very respectable. And really, really liked it. I want James Gunn's Superman to be good. But you know what? I'll tell you something. Truth be told, I would just like to see some great movies like I used to see in the 70s. The movies that made me love movies, like Bob Fosse's All That Jazz and Cabaret. Like Network, like Dog Day Afternoon, like Serpico, The Godfather, of course, Godfather 2. Hell, I'd love to see a science fiction movie like the original Rollerball. Norman Jewison, who could direct And Justice for All with Al Pacino, could also direct Rollerball. I would really like to have seen that. And then we got John McTiernan's Rollerball. I guess be careful what you wish for. I don't know. I just think that we are living through a time in our culture where we have become, I don't know, we're not very smart culturally as a whole. We're not. And we don't prize intelligence and we don't prize the things that we used to. And it's kind of a bummer. Got a lot of tips, man. A lot of tips. 1001 Johnny firing in the tips. Let me see if I can actually DUI Champ says Rob, don't hate me. Patton was a 3-star lieutenant general in the movie. He was promoted at the beginning of the movie. Okay. I didn't know that. Fuck that article. Well, I'm sorry about that. I'm looking for 1001 Johnny's part 1. 1001 Johnny, I don't see your part 1. Hang on, let me try and refresh. I got your part. This is a long one. You got a long one here. 1001 Johnny is fired in. I don't see part 1. Oh, here we go. Okay, here it is. Here's 1001 Johnny has sent. He's always writing fascinating stuff. Here we go. I'm just going to read it all. Have you heard of a story having a worldview? I understand this is a step in a Japanese storytelling theory where they need to figure out how their world. Hang on, I have to bring this. I have to pull this out. How their world works by understanding. Let's see why. You know what? I don't understand why. Hang on a second. Let me just make a little change here. Little change to make this easier to read, Johnny, because there's a lot here, and I want to give you your due. All right, so have you heard of a story having a worldview? I understand. I don't know why this is doing this. You know what? I'm going to change browsers. That's what I'm going to change. Let me change. I'm having a browser issue. Allow me to change browsers. Hold, please, so I can. I'll change browsers here. I know this is not scintillating live YouTube, but I'm doing this so I can better serve you. Okay. Here we go. Now I can get back to where I need to be. All right. So, all right. Hang on, let's get over here and start again. Let me start again. So this is 1001 Johnny. Have you heard of a story having a world view? I mean, I did not realize that this was a Japanese storytelling theory. I understand this is a step in Japanese storytelling theory. They need to figure out how their world works. I love this idea. By understanding how a normal person would live outside of the story's adventure. That is amazing. Let me just try this again. Have you heard of a story having a worldview? I understand this is a step in Japanese storytelling theory where they need to figure out how their world works by understanding how a normal person would live outside of the story's adventure. I love this idea already. If the writers and directors understand their story's worldview, this allows them to have the story be as realistic or as whimsical as they want or need, because they know how the people would live in a more heightened setting as if it were normal. I learned about this theory from a fellow on Twitter. He was saying JJ's Star Wars, has no worldview. And he gave me this when I asked what he meant. Oh, and he gave me a link. Like, I won't go to the link right now. I'll get back to that. A consideration of worldview. That's amazing. And to your point, Zack Snyder's films and how they use shorthand to trick the audience to fill in the blanks. Wow, that is exactly right. Instead of maybe natural interactions that show how the characters live. Maybe Snyder's film lack a worldview in favor of emotional visuals. I think that is absolutely true. All of that said, I love Snyder's films. I feel they capture a spirit of the battle for good over evil that other films don't capture often. I see this spirit more in anime than in Western cinema, but maybe that doesn't mean Snyder is a master of it, just familiar with it. He did base the fight Zod in Man of Steel on a fight from Birdie the Mighty, after all. Snyder is a very visual storyteller, and being very visual may be not possible to show how a normal person can exist in Snyder's vision. I love it, but maybe it's time to see James Gunn version, lest we forget how to see a normal life within the occasional view of a bird, a plane up in the sky. By the way, I saw Pryor skiing off a building 2 weeks ago. I thought that's why he wanted to star with Superman. It's true. That is really interesting. Now let me get to this. Let me get to this link that you sent me, because I think this is something that's right up my alley, and I can go get it. I will go get this. It's at a blog spot. Hang on. Let me just get this link. This is fascinating. I think this, by the way, is great, and I totally agree with it. So, so I have the link, and let me get in here and see if it takes me to that, and I can read more about this. Well, you know what? I'm gonna read this because I can already tell that I like it. I like this a lot. Okay, you guys are gonna like this too. So go with me here. This was written January 1st, 2023. A consideration of worldview, or Sekai-kan. The fantasy master J.R.R. Tolkien once described the notion of a secondary world in his essay on fairy stories. To make a secondary world inside which the green sun will be credible, commanding secondary belief, will probably require labor and thought, and will certainly demand a special skill, a kind of elvish craft. Few attempted such difficult tasks, but when they are attempted and in any degree of accomplished, then we have a rare achievement of art, indeed of narrative art, story making, and its primary and most potent mode. For Tolkien, creating fantasy is not merely the case of investing the world with magical elements, but rather ensuring that the audience can feel fully invested within the world. In other words, the world itself has to be present beyond the primary narrative. In Japanese media, even if the Tolkienian influence were not as present, there is a word that describes a similar approach toward crafting stories. The word sekaikan literally translates into English as worldview. However, despite the words originating from the German philosophical term, Dieter would have to pronounce this, Weltanschauung, sekaikan has developed a slightly different meaning in the Japanese language. Around the 1980s, the term became used as a different term for postmodern literary studies in Japanese media, particularly in manga, light novels, and games. In a sense, the word has replaced the Japanese word for settings since then. However, to merely view sekaikan, sekaikan, merely as a replacement of the words for setting is an inadequate explanation. Similar to what Tolkien himself has expressed, Japanese literary critic Eiji Otsuda argued the importance of developing a setting that can feel real to the audience. In order to make a fictional world feel real to the reader, it is essential to have characters who act and see things rooted in that world. It must be expressed in relation to a fictitious world rather than a real world, and both are related to each other. But sekaikan goes beyond the setting of the narrative. Setting is usually only referred to at the same time and place of a story. But where are our characters now? When did X event happen? Worldview goes beyond that by not just exploring the when and where of a story, but also about the how and why of the world within the narrative. Well, Tolkien was the master of that, creating all of Middle-earth. I mean, he knew everything about that world. A good analogy would be to think of the setting as the ingredients and the worldview as the main dish. Setting includes things like magic exists in this world, demons in this part of the world, or why is a great human kingdom. Sekaikan combines all these elements into a world which has to function beyond the needs of a story. It's about how the main character perceives the world as a whole. For example, to our main character, demons are bad might be a view held by the main protagonist. A reason for explaining why the demons are to be considered bad is because demons have killed a lot of innocent civilians in the past. But that's merely the setting. The worldview goes a level beyond that by placing an emphasis on because humans of this world perceive the act of killing unarmed and defenseless humans as an evil act. Sekaikan, or worldview in this case, defines the values which the characters hold and the values they reject. It's about how a character acts and also why the characters act in a certain manner. If, for example, the human civilization of what world did not view killing innocent civilians as an evil act, then having the protagonist be angry at demons for killing innocent civilians would result in the worldview of the story falling apart. In tokusatsu, for example, this approach, with centering the stories on their worldview, helps to enable a different communication approach between the creators and the audience. The actions of our central hero protagonist does not necessarily define what is right or wrong in the narrative. Instead, there can often be multiple heroes, each with different perspectives of what is right or wrong. Takashi Inoue said, "If you try and focus on the heroism of a single hero, it will never be accepted. I think it would be better if the world itself were the hero, or if the worldview, not the individual, were the hero. I want to go to that world. That world is interesting. I prefer it that way." It is the values which shape and define our heroes which communicates what the definition of heroism meant within a fictional narrative. The values in which everyone in that narrative shared is what defines the idea of heroism in those writings. Moreover, Sekaikan defines the rules of technology, abilities, and actions of the world in a consistent manner. In Western fiction, especially in sci-fi and fantasy, these rules are often bent to serve the needs of the main story. Take Star Wars as an example. In the sequel films, what light speed can or cannot do in the story is entirely flexible. The speed of light speed is acting according to the needs of the plot. Our characters need to get to this place within a certain amount of time and manner, so a spaceship can suddenly jump to multiple planets much quicker than ever expected, or can somehow bypass shields. In The Last Jedi, for example, light speed is now able to act as a ramming weapon itself. In Japanese media, however, this is generally not the case. Once a worldview has been defined, stories are created in support of that worldview rather than the other way around. The production team in anime often defines the worldview first before developing the characters and the stories itself. Even if someone suggested an interesting storyline, such as there's a beach ball episode, such ideas will be turned down if playing beach ball doesn't agree with the worldview. In other words, stories in many Japanese media are an exploration about the worldview rather than the other way around. In Japanese role-playing games, for example, what has already been created is the worldview. It's of the game itself. The player character explores that world and interacts with it, thereby creating their own story within the game. The player character cannot change the rules of the game in order to complete the story. Let's illustrate a case in point. If, for example, the worldview of a work is a place where fire magic is easily common and available to everyone, then there will be no need for anyone to invent a fire lighter. The history, culture, and ability of that world limits the possibility of such technology being invented in the first place. What makes a good or bad worldview does not have anything to do with how realistic the secondary world is, but merely a case of whether the internal structure of the worldview remains consistent throughout. A worldview in which someone can land safely on their feet after falling from 10 floors is a different one from which somebody will die after falling from such heights. A worldview in which kaiju exist also is naturally different from one in which they cannot exist. Lastly, a worldview is also about the world that exists outside the perception of our characters. History, laws, customs, they all have an existence to them, even if our characters rarely interact directly with those aspects of the story. The society remains functional even when we take our characters out of the world. In other words, the worldview doesn't exist to serve the story of our main character. This enables the worldview to be used in all other secondary media like spin-off or sequels. Neither does spin-off or sequels have to directly correlate to the main story in which they came from. They are not canon in the sense used in Western media. A spin-off does not have to share the same set of events happening from the prior work as long as it retains the same worldview. The values which define the world would remain the same, but the new material is merely a different perspective or story about the same worldview. To sum it up, the modern Japanese approach to storytelling can differ significantly from Western approaches, rather than to see the lore of the story merely as nice background information to have, or to see them as interesting settings for the main narrative. Modern Japanese creators approach storytelling differently. By defining worldview first, what we have instead of stories about a particular worldview is telling a story about a world instead of just stories about the characters. And in a way, Japanese creators are students of Tolkien's approach to storytelling. Wow. Okay, I've just had my mind blown. Now I know why modern Star Trek, modern Doctor Who, and modern Star Wars are fucking terrible. Because the creators don't have a fucking worldview. And yet Star Wars and Star Trek and Doctor Who were created originally with a worldview. That's it. Right then and there. Now I've just you've defined, thank you, 1001 Johnny, for giving me this. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but look, I've been banging on about this very thing, that creators come in and tell these stories and they fuck up the worldview. We call it canon. I know that they disagree with what that is. I understand why they disagree with it. But when you watch a show like The Acolyte, they want to come in and change what the worldview of the Star Wars universe is. Light speed skipping. When I was watching the Millennium Falcon at the beginning of Rise of Skywalker, I wanted to throw something at the screen. And you know, when you say that's not how faster than light travel works in the Star Wars universe, people laugh at you. But you know what? Yes, that's not how light speed travel works in the Star Wars universe. You can't come in and out. They defined it. They defined it in Star Wars. You have to use a navicomputer because if we bounce too close to a supernova, that'll end your trip real quick, wouldn't it? But then they just get rid of those things. What a great article. Man, worldview. Now I'm obsessed. Now I got to read all about this. Let's see. There's a lot of people chiming in on this. Thomas Logan says, the Patton remake by Jane Schoenbrunn, starring Cynthia Erivo as Patton and Elliot Page as General Bradley. Written by DEI with an original score by Lil Nas X. I heard something really interesting today. I was watching a YouTube video, and it was talking about, obviously there's a lot of talk about DEI and all that now. But what was interesting was they were talking about, this guy was talking about how one of the heads of one of the large tech companies in Silicon Valley says they're finding it harder and harder to hire kids that are coming out of Ivy League schools because they have this mentality. First of all, with all, ideologically captured. What's going on in institutes of higher education is not so much education as it is indoctrination. And what happens is our Ivy League schools used to provide a certain level of competence from the students. You could expect a certain level of education when you came out of Princeton or Stanford or Yale or whatever college. And what they're finding, especially in the tech world, is a lot of the people that are coming to work out of these schools do not possess the skills they used to have. Because they're going to college, and while they're in college, they're learning to hate the very institutions that they want to go get hired by when they graduate. So it's kind of a self-perpetuating. Do we want an activist culture? Look, I'm of the opinion that we've been played. There's been so many bad actors and external forces doing this, corrupting our systems from within, because they can't destroy us militarily. That's been going on for a long time. But I think that is kind of happening. There's people that reject these very systems that they come from. I watched a video today where a kid was talking about how he doesn't believe in capitalism, he doesn't believe in the market economy, and yet he's got an iPhone and he's enjoying the fruits of the market economy and he's enjoying the fruits of Western civilization, but all he can do is talk about how he wants to smash it all. Well, you can't have it both ways. And that's the thing. The activism today is not genuine. The activism is the point. That is the accomplishment. I've become an activist. Look at me. I think the same thing. Look, DEI, since you brought it up, Thomas Logan, DEI is not the idea of getting people a leg up and giving people that wouldn't necessarily have chances to get the chances that everybody should have. That is an admirable goal. The more people and the more perspectives from all walks of life, every shape, size, color, creed, sexuality, whether you're Republican, whether you're a Democrat, everybody should be able, we want everybody to have the opportunities to come up and enter the workforce and do whatever it is that they want to do. Everybody should. I want more people. I want people to become storytellers that I haven't heard their stories. What do I say at the end of every show? The problem is when DEI becomes a thing, the activism and DEI itself becomes the point. And that becomes then everyone's, oh, you were born a racist. What does that have to do with giving people a leg up to get opportunity? That it's not the same thing. And then activism becomes the point. And what should become the point is getting all the people that don't have opportunity and rise them up and give them opportunities to succeed. And what's happening is that that's not happening. We're not seeing more people come in. And when they do come in, they're not excelling. They're getting these opportunities. Maybe they're not right for them. They're not, and it's become problematic. But the idea of DEI is not bad. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a great idea, and I'm all for it. The problem is when you put it in practice, that's not what's happening. You're not getting people, you're not opening the doors to allow people to excel, and you're not holding them accountable. You don't get a pass, and then they start lowering standards. Why are you lowering standards? Everybody, doesn't matter who you are, can all step up. That's the whole point. You want people to come in, make it harder. So people have to rise up and be better. We've lowered all of our standards. We don't have SAT scores anymore to go to colleges because, SAT scores are somehow wrong. You mean measures of aptitude are wrong? If people can't do something, then they can't do it. Then they can go back and work harder and figure out how to do it and come back. So I've never understood, that weird thing. But that was very funny. DUI Champ says, Rob, you're the Captain Ahab of Star Trek. You took an unjustified swipe at my strange new world. Did Anson Mount take your prized appendage? One day I'll write you the Magna fucking Carta of Defenses of Strange New Worlds. Here's the thing. You can't write a Magna Carta or Defense of Strange New Worlds. You know why? Because the people that are writing Strange New Worlds are not good writers. They're not good writers. The people that wrote the original Star Trek were novelists. They were playwrights. I mean, they were short story writers, and they wrote screenplays that were actually great, and they were people that lived a life. The people that are writing Star Trek Strange New Worlds, you know what Strange New Worlds is? Strange New Worlds is a copy of a copy of a copy that has one central guy who's handsome and everyone likes him. And what it's done is it's taken all of Star Trek and dumbed it down and made it palatable for people who know Star Trek from osmosis through pop culture. Star Trek Strange New Worlds is a profoundly stupid show on every level. It masquerades as a show that's much smarter than it is. But Star Trek Strange New Worlds is a show for ordinary people. It's a show for people that do not want to aspire to be great. They do not want to aspire to live in a world that's better than where they're living now. It's comfort food for people that want to be reassured. Star Trek Strange New Worlds is a terrible show. It's worse than Discovery on certain levels, but it's much more delicious, but it's empty. And you can write your Magna Carta defense. I'm happy to read it, and I'll give it its due. Hell, I'll have you come on the show and you read your Magna Carta defense, and we'll put it up there. But it's a copy of a copy of a copy. And Strange New Worlds has done some unforgivably stupid things, like what it's done to the worldview of Star Trek. Gorn's being one of the most egregious examples. But anyway, Thomas Logan says, so bring it. Bring your Magna fucking Carta of Strange New Worlds. I'd love to read it. Maybe I'll learn something. I'm open-minded, Superman, Thomas Logan says, Superman 3 remake. Erivo is Soups and Page is Pryor. Hey, you know what? I think Cynthia Erivo is really talented. I think she's quite beautiful, and I think she'd make a great Storm. I'd like to see that happen, to be honest. 1001 Johnny says, did I break your stream, Rob? I'm so sorry. No, you didn't. DUI Champ says, to back up what that super chatter said about the need for worldviews, I just read a Kurt Vonnegut quote where he said every writer needs a worldview. I totally agree with that. I think you absolutely do. It's the most important thing. And I'll tell you something. Again, the people that are writing Star Trek Strange New Worlds do not have a worldview. They certainly don't have Star Trek's worldview. That's the problem with all these people working in these modern franchises. They want to change the worldview of the thing that they're writing about. So, Mike G says, thoughts on The Brutalist? I didn't love it in the theater, but I've been thinking about it. Could it be a subversive take on the Fountainhead? I absolutely think that. By the way, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to admit something to you guys. This is terrible to admit. I've seen The Brutalist, but I watched the screener. I haven't seen it in the theater. So to be honest, I don't think I've really seen The Brutalist. You get these Oscar screeners. People, now it's, you don't even get the screeners. You get passwords to go watch these movies. And I've been watching a lot of Oscar screeners. And The Brutalist, I really liked it, but I need to see it again. I need to see it in a theater. I think, and I'll tell you why. And Thomas Logan's probably screaming in terror if he's still watching this right now. So, again, the reason the theatrical experience is important is because a movie theater is a sensory deprivation tank. There's nothing else going on except what you're there to watch on the screen. And I honestly believe that psychologically, when you go and sit down, you pay money, you've gone to a theater, you've got your popcorn or whatever, you're settling down, you're mentally, there's a discipline there. There's a discipline to sit in a theater and watch a movie for, The Brutalist is 3.5 hours. With that intermission, when you're doing that, and again, this is all conjecture on my part. I'm making this shit up. But I really believe this over a lifetime of going to see movies. I've literally seen thousands of movies in my life in a theater. And I know when you go in and watch them in a theater, your mind is much more opened up. The things penetrate deeper. The concepts, the images, everything that's happening on a movie screen. And it's huge. It's much bigger than real life. That's another thing. We're seeing the human animal bigger than we ever see them. Like we live in a world with a fixed focal length. We can only see the world in one way, basically 50 millimeter lens. But not with movies. You can see the human face depicted. You know, everyone said, it's very funny to me. Everyone talks about how that face of David Cornsweet looked weird. You know, well, that's what cinema does. It distorts and makes us see the human animal, a human face, differently than it appears in real life. And, you know, if that image was in a theater on a giant screen and Superman's flying very fast, maybe it would work better than we saw it. But that's part of the reason you go to the movies, is we get to see humanity in ways that we don't normally get to see humanity. And that's, and when your mind is open, it's like there's unfettered access to your subconscious. So you learn more, you feel more, you are more. That's why I think the theatrical experience is so important. And also the act of going into a room with a bunch of perfect strangers. And there's a sense of community. You go see a big movie that's packed on the weekends. You might be sitting right next to somebody you would hate in real life. But you both have an interest in seeing this story that's presented. It shows you that there's a common ground that can be found basically with all people. You know, a movie like Barbenheimer, people are going to see Oppenheimer and Barbie. All different kinds of people. And that's my kind of thing. I mean, if what other cultural event brings people like that together? You know, in a place where you have to actually go there to experience it, not like watching the Super Bowl at home, but going to a place, we're all going to the same place. We've all made the decision to leave the house, get our friends, go somewhere, and we're excited to sit down to have a communal experience with our fellow human beings. Look, man, I love Companion. And when I say I love Companion, I mean I loved it. It's a great movie, and I understand it's a great movie at scale. Is it Lawrence fucking Arabia? No, it isn't. But it's a B movie that totally understands its worldview. And it gives us that movie. And it sets up its world, does it very well. And if I always say on the show, if A, B, and C are true, D, E, and F must also be true. And you have to be very careful to make sure that's the case. And again, Star Wars, Star Trek, Doctor Who, all of these, I mean, comics, the people that are writing these things want to change the worldview. But that's not theirs to change. And that's why our IPs suck. Because the people writing them want to make them their own. But they're not their own. You don't get that. You know what? Rings of Power is a bad show because it's not doing what J.R.R. Tolkien did, which is create the world that it takes place in. It doesn't understand its own world. Rings of Power, I understand. I love this. I love you, 1001 Johnny, for telling me this, because my God, so much of it just all makes sense now. It all makes sense. Dee's Webos has been a member of this channel for. By the way, I didn't answer Mike G's question when he talks about the Fountainhead. Yes, you know, I do think that there's definitely. I'm surprised not a lot of people. It's weird, you know. Ayn Rand is not popular these days. I discovered her in junior high school when I read her book Anthem in my junior high school library. Yeah, then I went and read Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and read up a lot on what objectivism is. And I hate to say it. I mean, you know, people always make fun now. They're always like, oh, you know, Ayn Rand is something you liked when you were younger, but when you grow up, you grow out of it. Lately, maybe not. I don't know. There's a lot of her on YouTube. You can go watch her talk, man. I would love to have met her. What a battle axe she was, man. Yeah, bring it on. That would have been some great stuff. Governor Nero says, I sit upon my throne watching the hills run red in blood and fire. Now that I've reopened the Hellmouth, Buffy has pledged to return to California. I welcome the old woman. Her tears will salt the earth. I'll use her slayers as toothpicks for my dingleberries. Governor Nero, that's pretty great. I love that. That's pretty great. Thank you for watching The Hills Run Red. I'm hoping you're not watching the Western, but you're watching the horror movie that we made. Which, I'm pretty proud of that movie. That's great stuff. DUI Champ says, is the anti-DEI movement as dangerous now as the initial DEI movement? That's a good question. Again, I think that the idea of all of that was definitely the idea of it was good. The idea was you want to give people an opportunity who haven't had opportunities to have them. I think that initial impulse is good. But then it turned into a cudgel where it was being used to exact revenge, or it was being used in a wrong way. It was being used to victimize people. And again, Robin DiAngelo's book, and a lot of the academia that came out of it. I mean, and it coupled with Marxist thought and all of that, it turned out to be something not good. Like, look, here's the thing. I'm only interested in merit-based achievement in every part of our world. When we start diminishing things by lowering standards, it hurts everybody. And we as a society should demand more rather than demand less. To be in a society should be something that we always work hard for and strive for and try and achieve something new. This idea that we want to make it like, testing people is somehow racist, or math is somehow racist. Oh, really? Well, tell that to a computer programmer or somebody who has to write code. Tell that to somebody who's going to launch a rocket and hope it lands on a comet. I mean, all that kind of stuff is ridiculous, and it has always been ridiculous. And we should be going the exact opposite direction and demanding more from people. We should always demand more from people. Why should we allow mediocrity to stand? Americans didn't used to be like that. We would expect people to work hard and make something of themselves. And it's so funny now. It's like hard work. You know what? Hard work, it's hard. It's like you want to put your nose to the grindstone and work hard. Go do it. Go do it. Why aren't you doing it? And don't blame anyone else. We have examples. I don't have it here. Oscar Michaud, who I was talking about on Let's Get Physical Media since it's Black History Month. I knew nothing about black filmmaker Oscar Michaud. He was a man. He ended up making 44 motion pictures. A black filmmaker. He died in the early 50s or the mid 50s. I didn't know anything about him till Kino Lorber sent me a documentary and a collection of his films. Looked him up. He was a self-made black man, and he traveled. He had many different businesses. He failed at some. He started a movie studio, and he was making movies. He was making silent films in the 20s, and he had a lot of people like Stepin Fetchit, and people that we know in Hollywood. I knew nothing about him. And since last week when Kino Lorber sent me a box, and that guy had a lot to say about, and I'd never heard of him, and he made all these movies. I didn't know anything about him, and now I have a documentary, and I'm going to start going through the box set of his films, and he was back he started a studio, and he was saying to everybody, look, we got to be better. You got to step up. What a fascinating guy he was. I don't think he would have any. He wouldn't say many good things about DEI, because part of what he did in his life was he tried to galvanize the black community to rise up and do some work, because he was very accomplished. Oscar Michaud. Look him up. Really interesting cat. And Kino Lorber just released a documentary on his life and a box set of his movies. So really, really fascinating stuff. So is DEI the anti-DEI movement? Look, there's a lot of dangerous things going on, but there's a lot of changes that had to be made, and we'll see where this is all going to go. Remember, I mean, this is what the American people wanted. The majority of the American people wanted our current the president in the White House and the things that he espoused to happen. So that was a fair election. And whether you liked it or not, or whether I liked it or not, we're now going to have to live through it and see how it's going to go. And if we don't like it, we have a political process that we have to be activated and be active in to work within it. I find what's going on both horrifying, but I'm kind of also optimistic. I want to see what happens. I mean, at least this rapid fire change is happening. I mean, it's like a bull in a china shop, but I'll tell you one thing. It was really interesting to see tonight Netanyahu and Trump together. Trump just saying, Gaza's a demolition spot. Let's go fix it and relocate these people. I mean, it's really interesting. I've been listening to the bullshit that Gaza is an open air prison. And now it's like, hey, let's open it up. Everybody can leave if you want. And now people are like, no, it's really interesting. It's really, what I find really interesting is we're going to see a lot of people going crazy. And sometimes I think maybe that's good, because people need to be reminded of what it is they really want and how far they're really going to go. And what are you prepared to do? How far do you want to go for your beliefs? I mean, I want to see American democracy prevail. I do. And I would like to see this entire country. We are all Americans. And we need each other. You know what America's become? If I can use a Star Trek analogy. In The Enemy Within, which is one of the first 10 episodes of Star Trek, it's the episode where Kirk is divided, he's split into two by the transporter. And he is, on one hand, he becomes this, one side of him is this evil, brutish, I'm going to go have my way with Yeoman Rand side, the darker side. And then the other side is the nice, compassionate, loving Kirk. But that guy can't command. And the evil Kirk will take what he wants, and the evil Kirk will hurt somebody. But you find out at the end that to be the captain of a starship, you need both sides. Well, in order for America to work properly, you need the right, you need the left to come together and figure out a way to talk to each other and work together. The problem with this country, yes, are the deep divides, but it's because each side has vilified the other. We're split. We're Captain Kirk split in two. Where America needs both. We need both conservative thought and progressive thought to work together. We do. We have to have that. And we're so at each other's throats ideologically, personally, socially. I mean, we are the country that all of our crazy inclusion and all of our... Remember, Americans are still the only people on the planet Earth who can say like, hey man, I want to build a rocket and go to the moon. And other people will be like, that sounds cool. Can I help? What can I do? And then you need people from all walks of life to help you realize that dream. In a lot of other places I've been, the first thing you tell somebody you have a dream, no, you can't do that. Why don't we just sit here at the cafe and talk about Proust? You know, we have a very unique mindset here, and we can't let that go. We have to put this country back together. America, the idea of America has always been great. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all of those things. And if you're an American, you believe in them. And our wherewithal, our can-do spirit. American, for all of our problems, but we have to figure out how to put it back together. We are the two split Kirks, and no one's going to fix the transporter and send it back and give us. We have to do it ourselves, and it's going to be hard work. Hard work. And until we start until we stop vilifying one another, we can sit in movie theaters with all different kinds of people. Why can't we talk to one another? We can sit in a room and be quiet. Movies should show you that you can, all shapes, size, colors, creeds, belief systems, sexualities, can all sit and watch Barbie together. If we can do that, that's a start. Let's all then go outside and have lunch and have a conversation. What did you think of Barbie? Start talking. That's what this YouTube channel is all about. That's what we need to do. On that note, I think it's time to bring this show. Well, wait a minute. Jason Webster sent in a $20 super chat. Jason says, filmmaking is creative art, like theater, literature, and painting. It's about conveying and communicating thought, emotions, and ideas that resonate amongst humanity across borders and cultures. Absolutely. Art is how humanity defines itself. I mean, look, you could just go through life and not think about each day. What art does is make us think about our own existence. And it makes our existence, I mean, you know, people ask, what is the meaning of life? The meaning of life is to get through the day. We've been given these days to get through, and that's the meaning of life, to get through them. How are we going to get through them? The great thing is you can get through them however you want. And art, for me, is the fuel that makes me want to go out and do other things, to create more art to give to people. I've been spending months and months and months making True Noir, sitting at this very computer, trying to make something that people will like, that will hopefully, True Noir is going to be 5 hours long. When it's all said and done, I will have created a 5-hour program. Yes, it's just an audio program, but I put my heart and soul into it. And it was great to have a great script, but I busted my ass. And hopefully that, and it's got an incredible cast too. The cast is incredible. So the script got me the cast, and my supervising producer got me the cast too. And it got me the fuel and the things I need to make something great. B Thing says, what would Landrew do? What would Landrew do? Landrew wouldn't do anything because Landrew's a computer. He's just a computer. That's all he is. But Landrew, he is of the body, and he would allow us to have festivals. Come for the festival, ya? Can you imagine? I mean, it was like The Purge, but way before The Purge was even a thing. So, yeah, that's what Landrew would do. So, yeah. And, of course, let's see. DUI Champ says, let me see that Strange New Worlds Pike figure you have hidden. Actually, it's the Strange New World Spock figure I have hidden. The Pike's right over there. But see, I can't. Pike is now behind T'Pol. I can't do that live. I've got, so there's now on this one shelf that was easily accessible. Well, hang on a second. Let's see. Turn it. Okay, you can see Pike. So there's Krug. There's my Saturn Award behind Krug. There's T'Pol, and wait, and there's Pike behind her. And there's actually a plaque from the Enterprise G that Terry Metalis gave me, an actual screen-used plaque. Shh! Don't tell anybody. So there you go. There you can see Pike. There he is. But Spock is Ethan Peck. I've never even taken him out of the box. Darth Plato says the postmodern Marxist fusion is a real thing. I know, and it's killing us. Listen, you know what? Major Chai Chai has written me a few letters, and I would like to catch up. She's got a few great letters, and they're quick. So Major Chai Chai, who's actually a retired Air Force major. Major Chai Chai says, well, I watched Section 31, and every 5 minutes throughout the movie's hour-and-a-half runtime, fuck or what the fuck would escape my mouth. Overall, this is a bad movie and a worse Star Trek movie. It's not even a good bad movie. The characters were poorly drawn and the plot was convoluted and inane. The dialogue was clunky and insipid, not to mention the modern-day colloquialisms that imposed the modern day into this movie. The writers certainly didn't understand Vulcans or Deltans. Rachel Garrett did not need to be Rachel Garrett, and the story implied that she was a rank-seeking careerist. This movie stirred emotions in me, but not in a good way. I felt nothing for the characters, and I'm angry that Kurtzman and his team tried to pass this off as Star Trek. Sad that this will become a part of Star Trek's legacy, and I'm embarrassed for the actors. Now I'm going to drink some rum and try and forget I ever watched the disaster that was Section 31. Couldn't have said it better myself, and I didn't have to because you did. Here's another letter from her. Dear Robert, I recently binge-watched Ted Lasso and thoroughly enjoyed it. It's the most wholesome, obscenity-laden show I've ever seen. As I watched the series, I kept thinking of Star Trek, that the characters, their arcs, and their relationships with each other could work in Star Trek and be infinitely better than New Trek. The tone was also optimistic like Star Trek. Ted Lasso and the other characters all have past traumas, but they don't let it define them, and they seek to overcome their shortcomings. I was curious if you've watched Ted Lasso, and if you have, does my observation make sense? I love Ted Lasso, and it absolutely does. It's like what Kirk says, I need my pain in Star Trek V. Absolutely right. But that's the thing. Writers, they just want to trauma dump on you because that's all they know. They don't, because no one's leading real lives anymore. You know, they're not leading real lives, so they don't have real human experiences and human interactions. So all they can bring, that's another thing, all they can bring to these shows, with Star Trek at least, is there's nothing authentic about them. There's no authentic character interaction. It's all made up bullshit. If you haven't seen it, please do. In addition to its humor and optimism, the series makes epic movie references. The first episode makes an All That Jazz reference, oh, I know. And the 6th episode has a hilarious scene discussing Scorsese's best film. And last night, I watched Paradise Episode 1, and I loved James Marsden's performance as the president. I could see elements of Bush, Clinton, Trump, and Obama in his characterization, but he created a singularly original character. I'm not going to read this next sentence if you haven't seen it. I'll watch the other episodes tonight and give you the rest of my observations. I'm going to see Companion on Sunday afternoon, but of course after I've watched you and Dieter on Let's Get Physical Media. For those of you who have yet to watch Hulu's Paradise, we're 4 episodes in. And while I would say that it has a very familiar storytelling tropes in it, like showing us things in the past and then coming back to the present, in 4 episodes, it's left my jaw hanging on the floor in 2 of those 4 episodes. It is great. The way I talk about airport novels, you get a great novel at the airport. It's not very filling, but it's a great airport read. If you haven't seen, there's 4 episodes of Paradise on Hulu. Don't read anything about it. It's better going in cold, because there's a great twist, and there's even more twists in episode 4. There's twists in every episode, but they're great, and it's really compelling stuff. I hope it's created by Dan Fogelman, who created This Is Us, and apparently he had the idea from a long time ago, and it got made, and it's really good, and the acting is really good. It's beautifully made, really good. Major Chai Chai has a 3rd letter. I just saw Companion, and I enjoyed the film. It felt like an Outer Limits or Twilight Zone episode with its themes of AI and sentience, being love blind, and what makes us human. I particularly liked the love story between Eli and Patrick. I also appreciated how scenes were framed and composed. Yeah, it's beautifully shot. However, I would have enjoyed the experience more if the woman sitting in front of me hadn't taken off her shoes and put them up on the seat in front of her. Every few seconds, I caught sight of these ugly finger-like toes. Ugh. Fortunately, I was able to get up and move away from her. That really sad part was the person was my age. Anyway, thank you, Brother Rob, for the recommendation. Chai Chai. Why would... You're not in your living room. You put your feet up on the back of somebody's chair that they're going to sit back in so you get your feet gunk all over them. How gross. People are gross. We're a bunch of Neanderthals, I'm telling you. And we you know, according to our DNA, not only are we Neanderthals, we used to have sex with Neanderthals. And that's how we are. We're just low-down, dirty dogs. That's what we are. Anyway, so let's see. I think I'm going to end the show. Let me just make sure that I've kept up with all of your comments and questions. Bruce Lum says, happy birthday, Rob. Great live show, as always. Have a safe and wonderful night. Well, I'm going to go back tomorrow. Shameless plug. I am finishing the final mix on True Noir episode 6. It is an epic, action-packed episode where lots of stuff happens down in Miami. The episode is called Welcome to Miami, Mr. President. And Barry Bostwick, who from Spin City and he from Megaforce, Ace Hunter from Megaforce and also from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And he did the American dub of my favorite animated film of all time, Fantastic Planet. He's in it. Big doings. Episodes 6, 7, 8, and 9 are huge episodes. They get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's why episode 6 is taking a little longer to finish. But it will be mixed, and Major Chai Chai will get her episode tomorrow night. But if you want to get all the episodes of True Noir, The Assassination of Anton Cermak, you can if you go to truenoir.co. truenoir.co, that's our website. And then eventually, when it is finished, it'll always be premium because we have to pay for the making of it. It was not cheap. But it will be eventually on things like Spotify and Apple Music and Amazon and things like that. When it'll all be done, it'll be available in individual episodes, or you can get one long thing where you can just listen to it all the way through. Of course, Michael Rosenbaum is our lead. Chris Carr from the John Campea Show is in it. But these episodes, episode 7 has everybody from Adam Arkin to William Sadler, Jeffrey Combs. Jeffrey Combs, maybe not. He's in episode 6 though. You'll see. You'll hear. You won't see anything. You'll hear it. And on that note, I want to thank all of you for being a great audience and generously supporting this channel via super chats and tips and all that. You know, John Campea makes a good point. Our tip feature, the tip feature is always up, and it's up 24 hours. I've never had anybody send me really a tip when I'm not on the air. But a lot of people have been, since I'm going back on the John Campea Show, I've been back there a lot. People send tips all the time. So if you want to send me a tip, I can read it. It's always in the description. But if you wake up in the middle of the night and want to send me something to read or put on the show, you can. And I will have the new Robservations letter address this week. I need to just turn it on. And you can send me letters directly to the show. And I will make sure that we can have that going because, you know, I love reading letters from you and all that. And on that note, everyone, I want to thank my moderating staff, Tom Jr. Jackson. But remember, every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear. And all you have to do, and we're not doing very good this year, all you have to do is listen. Listen. And thanks for being here, and thanks for going on this very rollicking journey. And, you know, it's always good to increase your cinematic palette, or having your cinematic palette, improve it. And, you know, find some movies you wouldn't necessarily normally watch. You might find something really surprising. And on that note, have a better night.